everyone, and welcome back to a new video. I've got another big chunky one for you today as we are looking at a book written by the wife of Andrew Wilson. Her name is Rachel Wilson, and you may recognize the name Andrew because he was in the last video that I made on this channel where I was reviewing a lot of clips from the Whatever podcast. Andrew was on there. He got very drunk and belligerent. It was very embarrassing for him. He spouted a lot of misinformation. His wife, Rachel, and God knows how the hell he got a wife, I was shocked, but it turns out she is just as delusional and ill-informed as he is, except it's probably a little bit sadder because she's a woman and she has this internalized misogyny and she's only hurting herself and other women with what she does. She wrote a book called Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation, and I was a little bit confused when I read this title because I didn't realize this was an anti-feminist book. I genuinely thought this was about, this is how women have been oppressed throughout history, being accused of witchcraft and having sex with the devil and all the rest of it, and how women rose up and how often, a lot of religions like Wicca and whatever can be very empowering to women and have very strong feminist undertones. And I thought it would be a really positive, uplifting feminist book just from the title. And then I read the description and I realised I was wrong. No, she's actually one of these people who believes that feminists are actually devil worshippers and evil, and this is all anti-Christian, and we are in league with the devil, and we are evil, and blah, 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 blah. So, the book description reads, Rachel Wilson brings this history to life, filled with incredible true stories of demon worship, spirit mediums, magic mushrooms, witchcraft, CIA spies, and sex cults. In modern society, it is simply assumed that women's liberation is a good thing. But what if it was never an organic, grassroots movement for social justice? Did feminism liberate women from an oppressive, evil patriarchy? Or did it rip away the fundamental structures that afforded them stability, security, and purpose, turning them into wage slaves for corporations and tax revenue cash cows for governments? What if feminism left women more vulnerable than ever by destroying the family? What if it's a cunning deception that has tricked women into abandoning their God-given identity to serve a new world order and one of the oldest belief systems in the world? Yeah, these are the words of a completely sane woman, right? Yeah, I trust her and all her information, don't you? There's a lot of conspiracy theories in this. There's we'll get to one part where she's like, look at this music poster thing. Their tongues are out, which means this goddess and this murdering cult and this is a symbol of this, and therefore all feminists are demon worshippers. I wish I was joking. It's really, really silly. Before we get into this book itself, though, I just want to shamelessly promote a project by one of my best friends in the world. If you are actually interested in feminist stories of women wrongly being accused of witchcraft, including a woman who did the accusing herself, only to realise her mistake later on when she herself is accused and she finally hears the stories of the other women and how they ended up there, then I want to recommend a new musical that will be playing on the West End this autumn and winter. It is called Coven, right? Am I saying that right? Coven. Like a witch's coven. Yeah, that's right. Sorry. It's called Coven, and it is co-written by one of my best friends, Daisy, and I've heard some of the songs from it, and they are unbelievably good. She is such a damn talented musician. I am going to be there for the opening night of previews, because of course I will. So if you want a chance to see it for yourself, it is going to be playing at the Kiln Theatre in London from October the 31st, 2025. And if you want to get tickets for yourself, I will leave a link in the video description. It is a beautifully written and directed and made feminist piece of theatre. And it's just absolutely wonderful. Very, very proud of Daisy and everyone involved. And I'm only a little bit sorry to the people who follow me over on Instagram who have seen me posting about it quite a lot already. I like celebrating my friends' achievements. I'm very proud of them. Anyway, enough about real feminists. Let's listen to some nonsense from Rachel Wilson. She opens her book by claiming, feminist ideology and its resulting political movements have been responsible for the most broad, sweeping, and fundamental social changes in human history in a very short span of only about 100 years. It is astonishing to reflect upon the fact that the overall structure and organisation of human families, governments, and society at large that were consistent across many thousands of years of civilization all around the world were completely dismantled in less than a century. I didn't realise this when I was just reading it in my head, but her writing is very poor. She really does have these long run-on sentences. Sorry, anyway. Also, are we living in the same world, Rachel? Completely dismantled? Where are you looking? Sure, there have been some great changes recently, especially in the last 50 years or so. Some, but not all, but some societies have absolutely become more accepting of other types of relationship, different family structures. There's been a definite push towards equality, we can't deny that. But to say that everything has been completely dismantled is so far from the truth when we're still living in a world where the systemic oppression of women, people of colour, queer people, disabled people, and so many more is still the norm. The power structures in place still support that oppression. She's also just plain wrong in claiming that before the 1900s, she reckons the structure of governments, family, and society as a whole were consistent across many thousands of years. It's like she's not even familiar with basic history, is it? Now, I'm not familiar with every single civilization, and there are many angles we could take with this to disprove her point, but as a basic example, and because I've been really enjoying history recently, it's time for a little history class, and I would give you a very basic example from the UK and our history. Our government has absolutely not been consistent for many thousands of years, or even just the last 1,000. Let's take a look at that, shall we? If you're not interested in history, that's okay, you can skip to the next chapter, but I think it should be interesting for quite a lot of you, and it would be nice if you want to join me on this. So, in the 1st century, so we're going back about 2,000 years, in the 1st century, what is now the UK, but this little island of ours, we were part of the Roman Empire until Britons revolted in around 409 CE. This included the Big Peasant Revolt, and ultimately what is now England was divided into lots of little independent kingdoms with different leaders calling themselves kings. For a while, it was believed that these kings were chosen by God, and so titles were passed down family lines because they believed they were all descended from deities. Also, a little disclaimer here, I'm giving you a very, very simple overview. A lot of you are probably more educated in this than me, and you can probably give way more details. If you want to expand on anything in the comments, please do, but just know I'm giving you a very basic overview for now. By around 600 CE, things were changing. Kingdom boundaries changed again, and at this time, kings began to be elected, but not by public vote. This wasn't a democracy as such. Instead, leaders were decided by a witan, a special kind of advisor or wise man who chose the new king from a range of eligible candidates. You see how we're still early on, and we're already seeing different forms of government already. There were also other types of rulers over smaller areas, so these kingdoms were often split up into shires and ruled over by earls, sometimes alongside bishops, so the Christian church was involved too. By 865 CE, Viking invaders had conquered most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and this was especially true in the north of England where I live and where my family has lived for at least the last 400 years, and apparently even longer because I have plenty of Viking blood in me. That's how prolific they were up in what is now Yorkshire and the surrounding areas. They founded many big towns at the time, like York, or as it was known, Jorvik. The only kingdom they didn't invade was Wessex, which was ruled over by Alfred the Great, and this position of that Alfred the Great held was passed down through his family for a few generations until one of them finally called himself the King of England. One of these kings, as they came to be known, was Edward the Confessor, and he started to make a more sophisticated government with a chancellor and a treasury. That wasn't really there before, so again, government's changing. Things changed again in a big way in the infamous 1066 with the Norman conquest of England. You'll probably know this because of the famous Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror defeated the king at the time, Harold Godwinson. This led to another big shake-up at the time, as the new King of England reclaimed ownership of all the land, meaning he was confiscating land from the old Anglo-Saxon nobility, and he gave it instead to a bunch of people on his side, Anglo-Normans. For a few generations, the title of king was passed down through the men in the family until it ended up with a woman named Matilda being named as heir to Henry I, her father. When she tried to take the throne, though, being a woman, she was opposed by a bunch of male barons. Her male cousin Stephen was backed by the English church and took her position until her husband, her half-brother and uncle decided to take her rightful throne by force. This led to oh god, so much drama, right? So she captures Stephen and then is like, I'm gonna be queen, this is it, I've got this. But she's instead opposed by people protesting in London because damn patriarchy, am I right? So her coronation was interrupted and she only ever got the temporary title of Lady of the English and not actually Queen Matilda as she should have been. Then there's this huge civil war called the Anarchy in the 1100s, and eventually Stephen became king again, but only because I think it was her half-brother was captured by his side, so she had to kind of swap them and be like, fine, you can have Stephen back if you give me him, and then Stephen became king again. He was only king for a little while and he didn't have any kids of his own, so he ended up being succeeded by Matilda's son, Henry II. Now, he was interesting because he created the common law legal system in England. And notice how I'm saying England at this time and not the United Kingdom, because Wales and Scotland and Ireland or what is now Northern Ireland, they were still independent, okay? United Kingdom was not a thing yet. Just talk about England. By the 1200s, there was even more drama, which led to the Magna Carta, which was written by the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and it promised to, and I quote, it promised the protection of church rights, protection for the barons from illegal imprisonment, access to the swift and impartial justice, and limitations on feudal payments to the crown to be implemented through a council of 25 barons. So another huge change. And this was because basically the king was being a bit corrupt. He was taxing people like crazy, collecting all this money. He was a bit of a dictator, to be honest. And the barons were like, hang on a minute, no, we need to rein you in a bit. Magna Carta. And an even bigger change was on the horizon. Somewhere between the 12th and 13th century, English Parliament was founded to work alongside the king and make sure he was still held accountable to the law, amongst other things. Basically, you couldn't have a king acting like a crazy dictator, like he was above the law, committing crimes and getting away with it. He still had to be held accountable to the same laws that the people in his country were. I know I have a lot of Americans watching, and this might be a little bit alien to you because of the current state of your political system, but yeah, your leaders shouldn't be able to get away with crimes. Wild, I know. The ordinances of 1311 aimed to limit the monarch's power, so the king wasn't just a crazy dictator, but the king at the time, Edward II, refused to agree to it. There was a bunch of crazy drama at this time, and a ton of it happened very close to where I live here in West Yorkshire. Basically, Edward II had this wife, Isabella, right? But rumour has it he was secretly in love with his friend and advisor, Piers Gaveston, and he actually built parts of Knaresborough Castle for him to live there, and so they could have a secret little love nest, allegedly. Isabella was not happy with this. A bunch of the barons across England were not happy with this. Partly a little homophobia, partly because they just didn't like their politics, and partly because Edward II wasn't agreeing to kind of stick to the rules that they'd set down, right? There was a hell of a lot of stuff going on. So the barons got together and they were like, well, if we want to keep the king in check, we need to go after Piers, right? His advisor, friend, possibly lover, roommate. And they ended up several times exiling Piers. He kept coming back, they kept exiling him, it was a whole thing. When he finally returned to England the third time, he was executed. Isabella's obviously not happy that her husband is having these affairs behind her back, allegedly, and also doesn't agree with some of his politics, so she ends up having an affair with another baron, and together they helped Edward the king be captured and forced to abdicate the throne. Now, she couldn't take the throne herself, the baron couldn't take the throne herself, so the throne went to Edward and Isabella's son, Edward III, and he became king at just 14 years old. But the thing was, he was young, he didn't really want to rule, he didn't really know what he was doing, so Isabella and her new husband became the kind of power behind it and were moving all the parts behind the scene. So much change, so much craziness, and now we're only just getting to the 1400s. Ton of stuff happened in this time. Wars in France, the Welsh Revolt, War of the Roses with power shifting and changing and styles of government changing all the time. What? Shocking, I know. Rachel Wilson could never believe it. By the late 1400s, we finally saw the House of Tudors coming into power. Firstly, Henry VII, and then his son, the infamous Henry VIII, who you'll all know, super famous, had 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. You know. He also created the Church of England and made himself head. He had a ton of disputes with the Catholic Church at this time. He had disputes with the Pope, and he wanted to take control for himself. One of the reasons for it was that he simply wanted a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope wouldn't grant it. So he was like, screw this. I'm breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm creating the Church of England and declaring myself the supreme head of this new church. He divorced Catherine, married Anne Boleyn, who he would go on to behead, and then there was this whole drama over who ruled England and Wales, and more battles and wars and politics. And when Henry VIII finally died, his son Edward VI, son of his third wife, became ruler, but he was still a child. He was very ill, he was not very well, and he very quickly died. He named Lady Jane Grey as his successor, but they were like, well, she's not one of us, she's not family. Why is she meant to be queen? And she was never quite really crowned queen, and she was deposed. Edward's sister Mary I became queen, and technically the first ever queen of England. Some argue that Matilda was, but because she was never crowning him the title. You know, some say Mary I was the first queen of England, right? And she quickly decided, screw the Church of England, England needs to be Catholic again. And she started burning Protestants at the stake and all this nonsense. There was drama with her and her sister Elizabeth I, people locked in towers, the Tower of London, tons of drama. There's really cool stuff where if you go to a lot of old British houses and castles and all sorts of stuff from this time period, you'll often find priest holes in the wall, which are kind of like secret little cubby holes behind secret door panels and stuff like that. Because between Mary and Elizabeth, so when Mary died, Elizabeth I became queen, and she returned the UK to Protestantism and made herself head of the Church of England. But while Mary was queen, there was all this drama between them, with some people being Church of England, some people being Catholic, and, you know, certain people were captured and all this back and forth. And there were these priest holes where priests would literally go in and hide, and the families would hide them away so that they weren't captured and killed. Fun fact. Anyway, Elizabeth I, she was huge, we all know her. After her death, we see the Stuarts come into power, and there was a whole bunch of drama with Scotland in the 1600s. In 1642, there was trouble between the king and parliament, and another civil war began. When that finally ended in 1649, the Commonwealth of England was established. In 1653, Oliver Cromwell declared himself Lord Protector because he didn't want to use the title king, but he was basically a dictator, kind of. He led the country, didn't want to be king, kind of dictated everything. This didn't last long though, and the monarchy was restored in 1660. By the time rulers from the House of Hanover were in charge, the monarchy had less power and were less active, and the UK was mostly ruled by the government and parliament instead. And I say UK now because in the 1800s, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was created. By 1832, we had the Reform Act, which, I quote, led to an expansion of the electoral franchise and the rise of the House of Commons as the most important branch of Parliament. And then, when Queen Victoria came to power, we also had the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the British Empire, and after her husband died, she became pretty depressed, and a bunch of people started calling for a republic instead of a monarchy. Didn't happen though, because instead we got the Windsors, who are our current monarchs. The 20th century brought the Commonwealth of Nations, and over time the king or queen became less of an actual power and more of just a traditional figurehead. There's still much more to it than this, despite this being a very, very long but very simplified version, but I can tell you that the longest serving British monarchs and rulers have been very strong women with very strongly held beliefs. Mary I, Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth II. Yes, there was some pushback to some women in charge, see the Matilda drama, and people who kept thinking women shouldn't be queens in their own rights. But society's views have always been changing and evolving, and it's absolutely not just things were static for the last 1,000 years until the damn feminists came along in the 1920s. That's just entirely inaccurate. So, I know this was long, I hope it was educational and interesting, but my point is, when Rachel makes this claim that like everything was the same and static until feminism in the 1920s, absolutely not the case. And also, Feminism, maybe not in name, but in spirit, has always been around and a bit of an underdog, you know? Back to Rachel's book, and she goes on to say that in an age where our lives are dominated by screens, our perception is constantly filtered through social media and entertainment. It's hard to find a portrayal of women that is not defined by feminist sexual liberation when our grandmothers had no such thing. But this has always been a thing. There have always been strong women in the world who wanted to be able to choose who they have sex with, when and where. And there's so much more to feminism than just sexual liberation. There has just always been strong women in the world. Women have been fighting for these rights for thousands of years, but it's only recently that women have actually been getting those rights. But the women who wanted them have always existed. I don't know why she thinks our grandmothers had no such thing, when sure, they didn't necessarily have the rights to those things and there was a lot more stigma around it, but the desires were often still there. Women have always been sexually active outside of marriage, or been sexual beings, or wanted kids without the husband and so on. It's just there's less shame and stigma around it now, and I can only see that as a good thing. She constantly paints sexual liberation as a bad thing because she seems to think it only means women are just being promiscuous all the time and having unsafe sex constantly, when in reality that's not what sexual liberation is about. It's about a woman's right to choose what happens to her and her body and her relationships. So it's about understanding consent. It's about a woman being able to choose if, when, where, why, and with whom they have sex. It's about little girls not being forced into marriages. It's about marital rape finally being illegal. It's about women not having their genitals mutilated, especially when they're children. It's about people not dismissing rape and sexual assault just because of who the victim is. It's about not shaming people who want to wait to have sex. It's about not shaming people who don't want to ever have sex. And it's about not shaming people who choose to have sex. It's about all of this and so much more. Right, I'm going to go take Kubi out, do some editing for the day, and I'll be back to film another day. Alright, day 2 of filming this video. Let's do it. Where did we get up to? Rachel says, in just a few generations, life for women, and therefore life for everyone, had changed more than it ever did over the previous 2 millennia. I would argue that this may be true of kind of recently, if you will, but this is mostly because of things like technological advancements that have been happening so much faster and on a bigger scale, not just because of feminism. She says, it is almost always simply assumed that these astronomical changes were good. To even question whether inverting the social order of human history in the blink of an eye was actually good for society or for women will result in angry accusations of misogyny and ignorance. It is taboo to ask whether feminism has actually made life better for women. It is simply assumed and insisted upon. Again, I don't think she's right here. I think she's just building up a straw man, right? I think we can all agree that in some ways that life has changed has not been ideal. Like anything, there are positives and negatives to it all. I don't think anyone would agree that every single aspect of every single kind of feminism is positive. I call myself a feminist, and yet I'm still critical of other feminists on occasions when they do things like exclude trans women or forget about women of colour or women with disabilities and so on. Feminism has absolutely been overwhelmingly figureheaded by cis, straight, white, middle-class women for a long time, and this has led to, and not always intentionally, but it undoubtedly has led to the erasure of women of colour, queer women, women with disabilities, working-class women, and so many others. I don't think anyone would argue that all views of all feminists are inherently good for everyone. And that's why I think it's important to look at the views of everyone with a critical eye. You know, whether that's people you mostly agree with or mostly disagree with, I think it's important to look at what are they actually saying and think about like, well, okay, I agree with this bit. I disagree with this bit. I think they have the right intention here, but they're maybe not doing it in the best way. I don't think it's ever right to just blindly agree with everything a person says. There's a couple of books I would recommend if you want to find out more about this. One of them is one that I admittedly haven't completely finished reading yet, so I can't give you a full recommendation, but from the first half that I've read, I would recommend Faux Feminism by Serene Kader. She talks a lot about the need for intersectional feminism and why this idea of choice feminism maybe isn't actually the best thing for everyone and why that can, even unintentionally, be harmful. And then another book I would recommend, again, only to some degree, is Against White Feminism by Rafia Zakaria. It's not a perfect book, like I say. I think there are a few things to critique. For example, she misunderstands some things about asexuality. Some parts come across a little turfy. She often shames people for being sexually active or wanting to speak about sex positivity. There's a couple of factual inaccuracies regarding, in particular, British history that I've found. But on the whole, it's a damn good book that looks at white feminism and why that is a problem, and really promotes intersectionality and speaks a lot about the struggles of black women and women of colour that have often been overlooked and forgotten about. I felt that as a white woman reading it, it was damn uncomfortable at times, but in a way that was very positive, because to me it like kind of showed me where my own privilege lies and why sometimes I've overlooked certain things and how I can change that. And I think that's really important for learning and growing. But again, this is what I'm saying. I can look at her book and be like, damn, she showed me where I was wrong and where I needed to grow and learn. But also I can look at her work and say, well, actually, there's a little inaccuracy here. Here's something she's forgotten about. So it's never about blindly following what someone else says without critique. And it's never about just thinking that you're always right, because I think we can always all learn from each other. But anyway, good book, would mostly recommend it. I think to summarise what I was trying to say here is that I mostly disagree with Rachel, because I think that most intersectional feminists like myself, and I would like to call myself that, we are actively questioning not only aspects of what right-wingers and anti-feminists say, but also aspects of what other feminists and different kinds of feminists say. And you kind of constantly look at these things and say, well, hang on, is this really what's best for all women? Is this really what is going to promote equality? Is this really the right thing for people? Is this the kindest thing? Is this the most supportive thing? What can we do better? Rachel makes out like it's some kind of like weird big conspiracy where like you can never question any feminist ever, otherwise like all the feminists will band together and come after you and She says to be skeptical of the inherent goodness of feminism is to hate women and wish for their abuse and enslavement. Just try being critical of any aspect of feminism in public or online and you'll be met with fury and outrage, with insults and accusations being hurled your way. And again, I don't necessarily think this is true if all you're doing is questioning a viewpoint or being a little skeptical of something. You know, I think saying, you know, about like a book, I'm like, oh my god, this author has some damn good ideas here, but I kind of wish she'd been a little more inclusive of trans people, something like that. I don't think that's, well, it will get you hate from some people. But on the whole, I would say most feminists, especially liberal feminists and intersectional feminists, and most reasonable people are going to find that completely reasonable. I think what people dislike is when people have viewpoints that Rachel has and that her husband Andrew has and that people who actively call themselves anti-feminists have, because in that case it's not just a critique of, oh, I see you have some good points here, but maybe this is something we can improve, because it's never just that with them. People like Rachel in this book and her husband in his podcast and everything are flat out misogynistic. And it's not just that like, oh, I'm a little critical because maybe they haven't thought of this angle. It's like, I'm very critical of them because they seem to actively hate women and want to oppress women and are promoting ideologies that are harmful to women. And I think there's a massive difference there. Then she goes on to say, like most people, I thought of feminism as primarily a political movement. I would never have guessed just how much feminism was truly a religious movement and how deeply the beliefs of early feminists motivated the cause of women's liberation, nor did I understand that feminism was not whatsoever an organic grassroots movement, which is how it is always described. In the course of writing this book, I have discovered that all political movements are actually spiritual battles at their foundation. Now, I can confirm as a feminist, I am not religious and I am not spiritual. I do not follow feminism as a religion. I am not fueled by religious beliefs or by faith or by spirituality to be a feminist. I simply care about people and care about women's rights. I personally don't see any characteristics of religion in how I view feminism and how I have come to the opinions that I've come to today. There's no faith, no worship, no superstition, no supernatural beings, no rituals, no sacred objects, no moral codes, and so on. It's more of just understanding the world around us and the society we live in and saying, how do we make this better? She goes on to claim that apparently in the past, the vast majority of women were against suffrage and the ideals of feminism altogether prior to feminist propaganda being taught in schools and university, broadcast on TVs, and spread through music and movies. Feminism was, in fact, very unpopular among most women in America and the West until the 1960s, as I will demonstrate later. So this is a really big claim she's making, and I would argue that while there were absolutely some vocal anti-feminists before the 60s, just as there were afterwards and just as there are today, I think it's unfair to say that the majority of people were anti-feminist, because there weren't really any official studies done at the time. There were some small-scale studies done asking women, hey, would you like this right, or this, or this, or this? And the results were really mixed depending on where you were and who you were, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which we're going to get into. But I think this is a really big claim that isn't quite backed up by facts. That said, I think it's likely that a lot more people were against it in the past than today, because as with anything, it takes a long time for people to start to oppose the status quo and try and make a change, and this is true of all social movements. In the past, more people were pro-slavery than they are today. Times change as people learn and grow. I don't think that's surprising, is it? And she claims that more people became feminists as the message was spread more on TV and in books and through media and so on, and she kind of makes it out like that's a big conspiracy and that people are being tricked into becoming feminists. But that's just how education works, isn't it? The more people become educated on a topic, the more people learn about it, the more people hear about it, of course the more people are going to be like, oh, actually that makes a lot of sense to me, and become feminists themselves. That's how it works. A lot of people in the past were pro-slavery because they weren't necessarily educated on how harmful it was to people. A lot of people were anti-feminist because they didn't understand the need for feminism. Once people become educated and people start speaking out about, against misogyny or against slavery or any of the other big social movements, of course they become more educated and their views change. This is how education works. We'll talk more about this later, don't worry. The final thing she says in this introduction that I want to focus on is, she says, if feminism was not the result of women everywhere demanding liberation from their terribly unhappy and intolerable situation prior to women's lib, then how did it come about? If the average woman was not the main driver of the greatest social revolution in human history, how did such tremendous sweeping changes prevail? Her argument is that it was a big kind of top-down conspiracy where you had some rich women who were trying to control everyone below them and trick people into becoming feminists. But that's not really what happened, is it? In reality, the majority of women did face some type of oppression, and there were certain women in all aspects of life who had been standing up to this for hundreds of years and trying to fight back against it. It just so happened that as time went on, the number of women doing this grew, more women were able to do it than ever before, and then they started to become more organised. We had groups of suffragettes and suffragists and other women's liberation groups. They started actively campaigning en masse. It hit the papers and more women heard about it, more women became educated on the topic and joined them, and social change began to happen slowly. Yes, there were some richer people funding a lot of this, because no big political movement can happen without funding and support and political power behind it. That's true of absolutely everyone, but that doesn't mean it's some big conspiracy. That's again just how politics and social change works. And then of course we had big events as well, like the war happened and women got the vote and women were finally able to have more of a say. And so as women were able to vote, their opinions began to be heard more and mattered more and more women began to think, well, actually, if I'm going to be heard, I'm going to think about what I want and ask for it. Women were finally having their voices heard, they were speaking up more, they were becoming more and more influential, and this encouraged other women to speak up and say more and become more influential. It was cyclical, and then it just continued from there. It's not a big conspiracy, it's just a regular society and political movement. The first time Rachel really gets into her kind of over-the-top crazy spiritual conspiracy theories and how all feminists are just like devil-worshipping, demon-possessed witches, basically, is in chapter 1, which she titles Origins, Early Ancient Religions, Goddess Worship and Witchcraft. Sorry, I'm having real trouble speaking today. It's very warm and it's making me very lightheaded and I'm stumbling over my words a lot. Please forgive me. She writes, Feminism is born of occult belief because at its core, feminism seeks to make women gods over men, or at least to deify women. The very essence of feminist thought is a worldview where women and men struggle for dominance. This is the, and excuse me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Hegelian master-slave dialectic, and it defines the feminist struggle no matter how often feminists want to convince us that it's about equality. But it is about equality. It's not about women she makes it sound like we've made up this idea that men oppress women so that we can somehow take control and start to oppress men. And that's just not even close to being the case. It feels like a lot of projection on her part. No one wants to treat men as slaves. No one wants to make men second-class citizens. We just want to stop being hurt and oppressed. But it's like, it's something I say in a lot of my videos, and it's the famous quote about how when you spent your life in a position of privilege, equality starts to feel like oppression. I think she spent far too long listening to men who have been in a position of privilege without realising it, and who are now starting to kind of live in slightly more equal societies, but not completely, and they're suddenly like, oh god, well why aren't we in power anymore? This must be oppression. Instead of realising that, like, they still have it really, really damn good. And just because, like, they even subconsciously want to oppress women, they think that, well, women must be the same. Women must want to oppress men, and it's not like that, is it? I don't know. Anyway, sorry, foggy brain still. Rachel goes on to write that goddess worship was once part of many of the world's oldest religions. You can find elements of goddess worship in Hinduism, Tibetan Buddhism, ancient Egypt, Greece and Rome, as well as in Jewish mysticism and paganism, amongst others. These goddess figures represent everything from love, creation and motherhood to sensuality, war and death. Yeah, true. And there are also a hell of a lot of male gods in those religions as well. So what's your point? She says Wicca and other forms of witchcraft are the fastest growing religions in the United States. This is directly due to the many decades of feminist propaganda demonising traditional religions such as Islam and Christianity as patriarchal and oppressive towards women. Christianity has been the main target of feminists due to its domination in the West. Yeah, have you considered that maybe it's one of the fastest growing religions not because there's some big conspiracy, but because it just resonates with people and their values today? It's one of the few religions that seems genuinely, like, pretty nice and inclusive and really encourages positive traits in people. It isn't oppressive. It isn't telling everyone you're dirty sinners who are going to hell and to be punished for eternity. It isn't associated with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, unlike, for example, Islam and Christianity. It's actually quite empowering, and maybe people are turning to it because that's what they need right now. I'm not Wiccan, but I can understand why it might be a source of comfort and support to a hell of a lot of people. Also, she seems to think that feminists target Christianity and Islam because we just hate the religions and want to bring them down. But have you thought we're not targeting them because we hate religion, but rather we critique the religions because they're harmful? If you've seen any of my videos before, you'll know that I am very much an atheist. I don't really believe in anything spiritual or religious or supernatural or anything like that. And I will critique any and all religions to the same standard, you know? This doesn't mean I hate all religions. It just means I will be critical of certain aspects of behaviour and ideology no matter what religion it comes from. Does that make sense? So it's not that I inherently hate religion, it's that I look at different religions and I can say, oh, I can see how this is a really helpful and supportive community for people. I can see how these beliefs really help them in these situations, even if I don't have those beliefs myself. And I can look at others and say, oh, you know what, this belief system is really damn harmful to these people for this reason. This teaching in this religion is really harmful for this reason and so on. And I can see the positives and negatives of both. There are absolutely some religions that I'm more critical of than others. Like, for example, there's a lot of aspects of Christianity and Islam that I am particularly very critical of. However, that's not because I hate those religions more, so I target them more. It's simply that, you know, there's more oppressive and harmful behaviour in Christianity or Islam, for example, than there is in Wicca, for example. If Wiccans started spouting that women need to follow modesty and purity culture and do this and this and this and dress this way and do this way and women must do this, this and this, I'd be like, whoa, calm down. Let's critique Wiccan beliefs here. But they're not doing that, so I don't have anything to critique it. Do you know what I mean? It's, yeah, I don't know. I feel like Rachel has it kind of backwards. If there was nothing oppressive there in the first place, there'd be nothing to critique. I'm not critiquing just for the sake of it. Rachel then spends several pages just listing off various female gods from various religions, mostly ancient goddesses, and the underlying, I guess, thought process behind it all is basically like, how dare these female goddesses have power, because how dare a woman have power? Ooh, it's terrible, isn't it? Damn women. She even flat out calls Christianity a patriarchal religion and makes out that this is a good thing and a positive thing. She doesn't seem to understand that, like, patriarchy is inherently oppressive to women, and she makes some very bold claims about certain goddesses from certain religions. For example, she talks about a Hindu goddess called Kali, and she says, "From the 13th century to the 19th century, a gang of professional thieves and murderers who worship Kali terrorized the subcontinent of India. Known as Thuggis or thugs, this is where the English word thug, meaning street criminal, originates. Thuggis were fanatical followers of Kali who performed ritual assassinations in her honour. The Guinness Book of World Records says the Thuggis may be responsible for over 2 million ritual murders, making them one of the most prolific death cults in history. Modern-day feminists, whether they are involved in occult practice or not, see Kali as an ultimate feminist icon." A lot of big claims there. A lot of big claims. I'm a modern-day feminist, and I have no real feelings about this goddess one way or another. Just saying. And I don't think any feminist, no matter who you are pro-murdering 2 million people. We're not going to sit here and be like, ooh, you know what? So-and-so murdered 2 million people in the name of a woman. Love that. Isn't that cute, girlies? Love a little bit of genocide. Oh. Just saying, you know? All that said, she doesn't really have room to talk, does she? When according to the Bible itself, okay, and here's the thing. Rachel is a very staunch Christian. She believes in, like, a very literal Bible. She's very pro-Christianity in her own way. And, like I said, yeah, she believes in the literal Bible. If you believe the Bible is real, then the God of the Christian Bible has killed around 2.4 million people, as opposed to 10 that Satan apparently didn't even directly kill, but was indirectly responsible for killing in the Bible. So if you want to compare death counts and murder counts, then maybe look at your own religion too. You worship that God, and he's responsible for more deaths than this other goddess that you just assume people worship when we don't. It doesn't really make any sense, does it? She then goes on to make some of the most ridiculous claims. Like, I barely even want to respond to this because it's so damn stupid. She actually sounds like an insane conspiracy theorist. Like, she's got a little tinfoil hat on here. "Folklore says that people with long, pointy tongues may be touched by Kali, or called to her, and may consider themselves under her protection. Kali symbolises liberation and female wrath at any attempt to be tamed by men. Knowing this, I wonder if it is any coincidence that so many famous feminist pop icons such as Miley Cyrus, Cardi B, Katy Perry and Beyoncé are so often sticking their tongues out, even on album covers and in huge televised performances such as award shows and Super Bowl halftime performances, which are so incredibly rich with occult symbolism." She thinks that Miley Cyrus sticking her tongue out is her wanting to kill and oppress men because she's invoking an ancient Hindu goddess. Or maybe it's a woman just sticking her tongue out. It gets crazier. It absolutely gets crazier. She then shows a photo of Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B, who I admit I'm not really hugely familiar with outside of Ben Shapiro reciting the lyrics to WAP, which I still love. That's one of the best videos ever. But I look at this and I'm just like, okay. And I'm just like, okay, it's a regular photo shoot, isn't it? They're beautiful women. It's beautifully shot. That's about it, isn't it? No, not to Rachel. There's a whole conspiracy behind it. She reads into a hell of a lot of symbolism. Of course, the tongues are out in reference to Kali. The two women are mirroring each other, which is a very popular occult concept. Mirrors are used in divination, telling the future, or scrying. Almost everyone has heard of magic mirrors like the one in the fairy tale Snow White. Mirrors have been used in occult magic since ancient Egypt, but mirror images can represent dualism, inversion, or in the case of Janus, seeing the past and the future. Their eyes are closed, which could be a reference to secrets, hidden meanings, or even the god of dreams, Morpheus. Now, do these pop stars know exactly what it is they're doing here? It's hard to say. Some may, others may not. But in case you think all this silly ancient goddess worship stuff is laughable nonsense that you would never take seriously, you must understand that there are a great many people today who do take it very seriously. Even in an age of technological advancement and scientific skepticism, people still need something to believe in. They still need a system of values and beliefs under which to operate. For radical feminists, some form of pagan witchcraft is a natural fit. I'm not sure I would call myself a radical feminist. I'm definitely more of a liberal intersectional feminist. But this all seems laughable to me, and I've never met another feminist who believes this stuff. I'm friends with a lot of people in the music industry, and I can honestly say none of them have ever been like, "Oh, do you know what we seriously need to do? Channel a goddess in our album artwork," or whatever. Like, sometimes, yeah, there will be references to, I don't know, mythology, legends, ancient beliefs, in the same way that there'll be references to literature and poetry and films and other musicians, because that's generally what intertextual references are. But it's not that people are like, "Oh, I'm gonna actually, like, channel a goddess because I believe that this one killed a bunch of men and I want to encourage other people to kill men." It's just kind of laughable. But it's also not, because it's so damn stupid. Chapter 2 is titled Chivalry, Witchcraft, Enlightenment, and the Revolutionary Spirit. She writes that no one goes into women's studies unless they are already totally committed to feminist ideology. There will be no reason to do so. Straight away, again, I have to disagree with this, both from personal experience and from what I've seen in others. I know we don't really have, like, women's studies in the UK, that's more of an American title, but we do study feminist theory in a number of fields. For example, if you study sociology, you'll come across feminism. If you study anything from philosophy to even economics and business, you'll come across feminism. Like, many fields have feminist theory in there that's taught alongside other areas, for example, Marxism, functionalism, whatever. Now, I have taken quite a few courses in my time, sixth form, university, everything like that, that covered feminist beliefs and ideologies. And the first time I ever really came across them was when I was studying sociology at A-level. And I went into those classes with the completely, now I realise wrong, but at the time I thought that, feminists were just these crazy man-haters and blah, 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 and they're all radical, and, they just hate men, and, like, I had that belief because that is what I'd seen on TV and read about in books, and I saw people talking about it and stuff. And it wasn't until I actually learned about actual feminist theory and read what actual feminists were saying, and also read critiques of feminist theory, that I began to, realise, oh, this is actually damn reasonable. I actually agree with a lot of this. I can completely see their points and think a lot of them are valid. Like I said, we studied feminist theory alongside Marxist theory and functionalist theory and all sorts of other theories, and then as I was studying other subjects like English literature and media studies, I began to bring feminist theory that I'd learnt about into those fields too, and I began to do more research and be like, oh, actually, turns out I have quite a feminist viewpoint here. And then again at uni, I discovered more and more different perspectives in these different fields that I was studying, and I always found myself gravitating towards the feminist theories, even if they weren't necessarily labelled as feminist theories, and I didn't necessarily know they were feminist theories at the time, if that makes sense. But even then, it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I even felt comfortable calling myself a feminist and being like, well, actually, you know what? This is a suitable label for my beliefs. This is what I think. This is a viewpoint that I have considered from many different angles and settled on, this is what I think, So I think that's a case of me studying feminist theory and taking some classes which may in another country be called women's studies, but going into them not being a feminist myself, but finding myself coming out of there thinking, yeah, the more I learn about this, the more I read about this, the more I'm educated, the more I agree with it. So Yeah, again, I think Rachel's got it a bit backwards. I know I'm just like one story, but I think it's worth considering. And as I say, I think it's really important to engage with work that you don't agree with as well. And I mean, like, look at me reading this book, for example. Um, as much as I'm disagreeing with a lot of what she says, I still think it's important to open myself up to it and read everything she says with a completely open mind and evaluate and be like, well, what do I think about this? Do I agree with any of it? Do I not? Is there anything I can learn from this? I don't think you should only read stuff that you know you're going to 100% agree with, because that's how you end up in an echo chamber. And that's how you never grow or learn. It's like when I was talking earlier about reading the book Against White Feminism and how that made me very uncomfortable at times, but how that was really important because it helped me learn and grow and hopefully be a better person. But at the same time, I also felt myself disagreeing with her on a couple of aspects as well. And again, that helped me learn and grow because it strengthened my viewpoint to be more vocally supportive of, for example, asexual people or people who openly speak about sex positivity or so on. Do you know what I mean? Even in this book of Rachel's now, I know I've been quite critical of it so far, but there's some sections coming up that I'm going to speak about where I was like, oh, actually, she's telling me some stuff about history here that I didn't know about and I'm finding quite interesting. And it prompted me to go off and read some new books on the topic and find out some new information. And once I'd done my own research, I came back and I was like, okay, I appreciate that she's talking about this history and whatever, but I don't necessarily agree with her conclusions or what it means. So I can see some positives in her book in that it still taught me something, but it's still so important to just critically engage with it and not just blindly believe or disbelieve everything you read. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? I hope so. My brain's still not working today very well. Anyway, she seems to think that the only people who study feminism are the people who are already feminists for whatever reason, and that the consequence of all this is that all feminist writing is biased to be pro-feminist. Yeah, I know, think about that. And that we never get people studying feminism who disagree with it, which, mate, she should have been in some of my classes at sixth form. I also don't think she realises that is, like, quite a burn against herself, because she's like, you know, you never get anti-feminists reading feminist literature. And I'm like, so you're admitting you've never read it. You've never studied it. Just saying, you can't... I don't see how you can be completely against something that you've never genuinely studied, but here we are. Anyway, her conclusion is, therefore, feminists always twist facts, which is literally what she's doing in this book, ironically, but anyway. She goes on to try talking about history and again gets a hell of a lot of stuff wrong. She says, if you were to ask a random sampling of 10 people on the street to briefly describe what life was like for women prior to women's liberation, they would probably say that women were oppressed, abused, and didn't have any freedom at all. They might say women could not have careers, own property, or choose their spouse, and that they were trapped in abusive marriages, raped by anyone and everyone, including their husbands, and forced to give birth on a continuous basis until they died in childbirth. You might hear that they were not allowed any sort of education, were not allowed to speak publicly or have any assets. Essentially, a life of slavery, abuse, servitude, and misery is what will be described to you. And she's like, but this is all delusional. Women actually had it really damn good. But I'm not sure who she thinks is saying this, because it's not feminists. Feminists will happily point out that yes, there absolutely was oppression in the past, but that it was different for different people. Different people had very different lived experiences, and some were happy even when oppressed, and some were unhappy even with minimal oppression, and vice versa, and so on, whatever. It is a very nuanced topic, and what was true for, let's just take the 1800s for example. What life was like for an upper class woman in the UK would have been very different to a working class woman in the UK. And then you also have to consider, what about women in every country around the world? Every woman would have had a very damn different experience and would have faced different freedoms and oppressions depending on where they were and when they were and who they were and what they looked like and what abilities or disabilities they had and so on. She wants to make out that there was never really any oppression, and it's just a conspiracy theory that feminists will tell you, and that women weren't actually oppressed. But she's forgetting that, you know, while yes, some women didn't have it so bad, because, you know, you had literal queens, right? You know, ooh, they couldn't possibly be oppressed, could they? Yes, but not the point here. She's forgetting that for the majority of women in, for example, the UK or whatever, often women were not allowed to own land or have money of their own. We couldn't even have a bank account in the UK until the 70s. That means for the first, 20 years of my mum's life, she couldn't have her own bank account. There were women who weren't allowed to divorce their husbands, but some men could divorce their wives if they wanted. There was a law in the UK which literally allowed husbands to sell their wives if they weren't, up to scratch. Sure, you might want to go back to the good old days, but did you know back in the 1800s it was totally common and okay for a man to literally sell his wife when he got fed up of her? The last case of this was actually in 1913. The idea of selling your wives was most common in the 1850s. One journalist at the time wrote a story of a butcher who dragged his wife to Smithfield Market with, and I quote, "a halter about her neck and one about her waist which tied her to a railing, and he kept her there until he could sell her to another man for the price of 3 guineas and a crown." So yeah, let's maybe not go back to the good old days when we were just property to be bid on and sold. This didn't happen to all women, but it happened to some. And on a societal level, the law allowed this. That meant that systemically, women were treated as objects, like cattle or slaves, to be bought and sold by men. Not every woman was literally oppressed by that, but there was systemic oppression against all women, and that's the difference. And sure, a lot of working class women were often allowed to choose their husbands and who they married and so on, but that wasn't the case for a lot of upper class women. Not all women were in abusive marriages or relationships, or not all women were raped, but the ones that were didn't have legal protection. Marital rape was legal. Women who were raped were often blamed for it, and the people raping them were never prosecuted or punished or stopped. Again, not every single woman was oppressed in that way, but the ones who were didn't have protection because of the systemic oppression. Not all women died during childbirth, but many did, because the healthcare just wasn't there for them. Getting legal, safe abortions or being able to take birth control was incredibly difficult for a lot of women, and because of this, many of them died. Not all, but some did, and the law wasn't protecting them. The healthcare system wasn't protecting them. Things don't have to have affected every single woman for it to be systemically oppressive. Working class women have always worked, but upper class women often weren't allowed to. Neither the upper or working classes had a choice in the matter, and it's that lack of choice which is down to systemic oppression. Education was available to some women, but not all, and even the women who were allowed an education weren't allowed to study certain topics or at certain institutions. And again, this didn't affect every single woman, but on a systemic level, it could affect any woman. No one is saying that life was hellish for every single woman and that every single woman in the world was unhappy. But what we do know is that there was a systemic oppression of women which stopped women have the choice and freedoms that we thankfully have today. And that today there are still systems in place which stop certain women having freedoms and choices. For example, in America, a lot of women are losing bodily autonomy. In especially countries like America, the healthcare system is incredibly biased against women of colour, which means that they don't get their pain taken seriously. They get lower quality healthcare. More women of colour are dying in childbirth and of what should be treatable diseases than any other group. Again, just because, for example, one black woman gets amazing healthcare, that doesn't mean there's not a systemic problem there that needs addressing. I don't think Rachel fully understands what systemic oppression is and what we mean when we talk about that. I don't think she understands what a lot of feminists are fighting against on a macro scale, She's one of these people who's more like, well, if it doesn't affect me, then it can't be happening, and she forgets to look at the bigger picture. She goes on to write, to a modern feminist, the only dimension of women's lives worth evaluating when it comes to determining their level of autonomy is that of sex and reproduction. If women were not encouraged towards rampant sexual promiscuity and proudly shouting their multiple abortions, everything else about their lives was irrelevant and they were captives of the brutal patriarchy. Well, this isn't even close to true, is it? Literally, she thinks this is all feminists want. We just want everyone to have a lot of sex and a lot of abortions. And I'm like, no. No. I spoke about this when I covered the Whatever podcast too, and reproductive rights are very important in modern day feminism. Sexual freedom and sex positivity is very important too, of course, but that doesn't mean we are forcing a certain lifestyle on women. We're not saying women must have this much sex, women must have abortions. It's about choice and freedom of choice and the ability to make those choices legally and safely. But it's also about so many other rights too. Economic equality, being free from violence and assault, equality in education, the workplace, social care, equality in healthcare, and so much more. To reduce it all down to only sex and reproduction is ignoring so many damn important issues that women face and fight against today. Just look at how, despite often performing better than men, women politicians are often taken less seriously, face far more abuse from the public and other politicians and the media. They are ignored more often, they are treated badly, they are objectified and sexualized and threatened far more often than male politicians. That's not just about sex and reproduction, that's about people not taking women in power seriously, despite them achieving better results than a lot of men often. I've spoken about that more in other videos, so I won't go into it now, but that's just one very small example out of many. She then goes on to try and list examples to show women have always had it super easy, and one of the examples she gives was this. For instance, women in ancient Egypt could own property and sign legal contracts. Egypt had multiple female rulers even as far back as 1800 BC, which is true, yeah, but they're also just one culture of women at one time, and you're not looking at every single facet of their lives in those cases, you're not looking at other cultures, you're not looking at other time periods. It's just one example of how, yes, there can be some freedoms afforded to some women, but that doesn't mean they're afforded to all women. She also goes on to say, despite instances of women having a good deal of legal and political autonomy and influence throughout history, feminist academics refuse to acknowledge this and instead invert these facts as evidence of women being treated as inferior if at any time they were not treated as if they were men. So because some women had occasional rights in some cultures at some times, that means in her mind women have never ever been oppressed in any way. She even acknowledges that there were many women who were not afforded the same rights as men. And she's like, but that doesn't mean you're inferior. It just means you didn't have the same rights as them. And I'm like, but do you not see how that's a problem? Do you not see how that is oppressive? One of the examples she actually gives, and this is quite a frustrating one, of women having a good deal is Hypatia. She says Hypatia was a female mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who lived in Egypt a few hundred years before Christ. And again, this is true, she was an absolute legend, I love her. And she's like, see, she had a job, she was an academic, she had it easy, don't know why you're complaining, women have never been oppressed. And I'm like, do you even know anything about her actual history? Because she's completely erasing the true story of what happened to Hypatia. And this is something close to my heart because one of my earliest videos that I've made on YouTube was actually about her and it was on this topic. So one of the people who's written a biography of her was Edward J. Watts, and he writes that in the 20th century, Hypatia championed the independence of women against a patriarchy that limited women's social roles and career opportunities as a new age dawned. So yes, it's true, like, she was championing for women's rights, she was this amazing philosopher, mathematician, and teacher. But that wasn't common for women at the time. She was the exception, and she was out there saying, hey, I'm a woman and I can do this, let's allow other women to do it too. She was the exception, not the rule, and she was out there fighting for other women who didn't have the freedoms that she had and the opportunities that she had, you know? Edward writes, she was a gifted philosopher who went into spaces usually dominated by men, taught ideas usually expressed by men, and exercised authority usually reserved for men. None of these things were without precedent, but none of Hypatia's female contemporaries tried to do them all. Hypatia did, and she did them very well. So yeah, she might have kind of risen above some of this oppression, but that doesn't mean there wasn't oppression for others. He writes of education and jobs for women at the time. Women participated unevenly in the educational process. While it seems that the growth in administrative jobs in the 4th century pushed more men to pursue a specific type of literary education, none of these jobs were open to women. There was no financial incentive for a family to pay for the education of a daughter. So this isn't to say that some people didn't still educate their daughter, they did, but it wasn't a common occurrence. And if they did educate their daughters, it was for a different reason. Not because they were choosing to, not because these women could go on and have good paying jobs and be independent. They did it because if their husbands died, they could still go on to educate their own kids without them. That was one of the only reasons for a family allowing their daughters to get an education. So yeah, she kind of rose above oppression, but there was still oppression of other women, and let's not forget one of the biggest things. Hypatia was murdered by a bunch of Christian men who didn't like her pagan teachings, which were just science and maths. They didn't like the fact she was a woman teaching. Her gruesome public murder was motivated by politics, religion, and gender. And sure, she had the respect of some men at the time, but it was all conditional because, as one blog post writes about her, Hypatia had earned this influence, but her position was fragile. It depended on a group of men continuing to agree that a woman should be given some sort of authority, usually reserved to them. And as soon as those men decided she didn't deserve that anymore, she was publicly, brutally murdered. That's not a woman having real independence and freedom. That's her being given a little bit by men who were still oppressing women as a whole systemically. When they decided they didn't like her, a woman, having any power or influence at all, they started spreading rumours about her being an evil sorceress, a witch, she's dabbling in the occult, and this literally led to her murder. Her legacy lives on, and she is absolutely a feminist icon that we should look up to and respect and learn about. However, you cannot use her as an example of how women have always had it easy, and they've had all these rights, and they've had it so good, when she was literally murdered by a bunch of misogynists. I also find it quite ironic that, she was accused of occult practices and paganism by misogynists and murdered for it. And then this whole book is Rachel accusing feminists of occult practices and paganism. Anyway, back to Rachel. She goes on to say, herein lies the essential underlying flaw of the feminist view on women's rights. None of the things I just mentioned are considered relevant if the women of history were held to any standard of moral sexual conduct whatsoever, or if an abortion was not treated as a sacrament. Anything less than this is total misogyny and patriarchal oppression. This view also leads them to completely ignore the fact that women have always had incredible power and influence via their sexuality that men have never enjoyed. So one, that's absolutely not what feminists think. And two, I'm sorry, but what is this incredible power and influence via their sexuality that you're talking about? Are you actually kidding me? Do you really think that women having their bodies controlled and policed and oppressed and used and sexualized and objectified and violently raped and assaulted repeatedly is sexual power? Are you insane? Women have historically, repeatedly been raped, and that's been legal. Auctioned off for marriage as children, sometimes sold by their husbands in the street, husbands that they maybe didn't even choose to marry in the first place. Women who were never allowed to control if or when or how many children they had. Women who were legally allowed to be raped by their husbands until in the UK, 1992. That's only 33 years ago. That is the year before I was born. Women were legally allowed to be raped by their husbands. Women were repeatedly dying in childbirth or had babies that were had out, or if they had babies outside of marriage, those were routinely taken from them and they weren't allowed to be single mothers. Do you really think that is incredible power and influence? These days, a woman can't walk down the street without being harassed, groped, objectified, catcalled. That's not a woman having power and influence through her sexuality. That's a woman being discriminated against because she is only seen as a sex object. If she genuinely believes this, then Rachel must have been living her life with her eyes shut. That's all I can say. As a woman who is a public figure, I have been repeatedly sexualized against my will. I've had people create fake sexual images of me and post them online using AI. I've had people send me disgusting sexual messages unsolicited. I've had people send me sexual photos unsolicited. That's not me having power and influence because of my sexuality. That's people seeing me only as a sexual object and harassing me, bullying me, victimizing me because of it. People seeing me in a sexual way isn't powerful. It's oppressive, and I do not like it. Just because someone gives you attention because of your sexuality, that doesn't mean there's power in that. Sometimes that attention can be oppressive as hell. And it's disgusting. And I personally don't like it. I know plenty of other women who don't like it. It's revolting. Even take her very own example of Hypatia. That poor woman was sexually harassed constantly, even while she was just trying to do her job. She was incredibly beautiful, but she decided that she never wanted to date, never wanted to marry, never wanted to have kids. She didn't even have sex once in her life. However, everyone, even historians today, seem absolutely obsessed with her sexuality and write about it at length. She made a choice to be like, I do not want this to define me, I do not want this to be who I am, I don't want this to be what I'm about. And many, mostly male, historians today have been like, you know what, let's dedicate 3 chapters in our book to talking about her vagina. It's not what she would have wanted. There's no power in that. Let's look at another example, right? Edward Watts writes of this, because it even happened at the time too, not just today. The philosopher Damascus discussed Hypatia's sexuality at even greater length. She was just and prudent and remained a virgin, Damascus wrote, but because she was extremely beautiful and good looking, a certain member of her inner circle of students fell in love with her. This student was not able to control his lust and made it obvious to Hypatia. Hypatia tried to cure this student with music, but when this failed, she brought forth a menstrual rag. This, she told him, represents the impurity of the body, and it is this that you love, not something beautiful. The young man then became ashamed, and his soul turned its attention to more prudent things. So she literally took a bloody menstrual rag, shoved it in his face, and said, this is what you're obsessed with, get away from me. Like, the fact that she had to go to these lengths to get a man to leave her alone is preposterous. That is not power and influence. That's something we don't ask for. You shouldn't have to do that. And to this day, we still have random strangers, even myself included right now, discussing her vagina as much as her work, and it's ridiculous. We shouldn't have to do this. Does that really sound like incredible power to you, or is that just an oppressive burden? Okay, I'm absolutely red hot. I'm gonna have to take a break. Sorry, I'm gonna come back and film another day. Hey everyone, I hope you don't mind me coming back with a voiceover for this last part of the video. It's been a very, very tough week. Just personal stuff. A couple of you asked last time what gameplay I'm using in the background when I showed this game, and it is so damn cute, I know that. It's called Bear and Breakfast, and it is absolutely adorable. I only just started playing it in the last video that I filmed, and this is my second time playing it today, and it's just, oh, it's adorable. I love it. So, let's get back to this book. Rachel then goes on to, unsurprisingly, misunderstand something again. She's actually factually correct here, she just misunderstands what it means. She says, geneticists say that the modern person has roughly twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. This is because throughout history more women were able to reproduce than men. Men have always had to compete for mates, with only about 40% of all men who have ever lived being successful in passing on their genetic material by reproduction compared to 80% of women. She goes on to say that she thinks this is because women have like an easier time getting men to sleep with them than men have getting women to sleep with them. But this is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how things have historically worked and what this fact actually means. When we talk about male and female ancestors, we don't just mean direct line, we mean all the ancestors. So sisters, aunts, cousins, step-parents, that's a big one. What this means is that statistically men were more likely to have either 0 children or children with more than one woman, whereas women are more likely to have children with only one man. This means that for every woman in the family, there's likely only going to be like one partner they've had, but every man in the family has likely had several partners. That's what it actually means. The reason for this is because men were more likely to die young in wars before having any children, but the men who went on to live and have children were more likely to outlive their wives, remarry and have more children. Hence, the 0 children or children with multiple women. Women were more likely to die in childbirth and so only ever have children with one man. There's also the fact that in some cultures polygamy was practiced, but in the sense that one husband had many wives instead of one wife having many husbands, and therefore one man having children with multiple women was also common. So this phenomenon isn't about women having more choice than men or having it easier than men or just being able to get more sex whenever they want than men. It's actually rooted in many factors that they didn't really have a say in. Like, you know, women in these polygamous families didn't necessarily want to be in a polygamous family, they just didn't have a choice. Or when women were dying during childbirth because they didn't have access to safe abortion or birth control, so they couldn't choose when or why or how they got pregnant. Well, yeah, also how, I guess. But they couldn't choose when they got pregnant, it was way more dangerous, healthcare wasn't the same. So, yeah, it's factually correct, but Rachel's interpretation of it is completely wrong. She then goes on to quote the notorious misogynist Roy F. Baumeister, who wrote Is There Anything Good About Men? And this is a book that I'm familiar with because feminists like Kristen J. Anderson, author of Modern Misogyny, Anti-Feminism in a Post-Feminist Era, has been very critical of it. Rachel quotes Roy, the misogynist, as saying, I'm certainly not denying that culture has exploited women, but rather than seeing culture as patriarchy, which is to say, a conspiracy by men to exploit women, I think it's more accurate to understand culture, e.g. a country or religion, as an abstract system that competes against rival systems, and that uses both men and women, often in different ways, to advance its cause. To put it another way, women are the choosers. So that's not what patriarchy means. No one is claiming that if we live in a patriarchy, it means it's a conspiracy by men. When we talk about patriarchy, it's simply a social system where men hold more power, and this oppresses women. Often it's systemic and not something people are consciously aware of. It is not a conspiracy. There is not a group of men sat there going, ooh, how are we going to oppress women today, boys? It's more that thanks to a very long history, today the whole system and organisations and laws and rules and social norms all sustain a misogynistic society without people being even consciously aware that it's happening. The same is true for racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and so on. When we talk about things like patriarchy or, like big ideas, it's not necessarily like a conscious thing. It's generally something systemic. To say patriarchy is a conspiracy by men and therefore it can't be real is a complete misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what it actually is. It's a straw man fallacy. Simple as that. I wouldn't really trust much of what Roy says in general though, because he's got plenty wrong before, and he spends most of his book, Is There Anything Good About Men, misrepresenting everything about feminism. To give you an example, in her brilliant book, Kristen Anderson quotes him at several points and summarizes one of his arguments as this. Baumeister's argument is that early feminists favoured gender equality, but today's feminists favour superiority of women over men. Feminism has been hijacked by man-haters. Baumeister never mentions a single feminist by name who represents this viewpoint, yet he is confident they exist. Note that it is feminists who are against equality in this worldview, not men and not patriarchy. From Baumeister's perspective, if it weren't for feminists trying to get ahead of men, the playing field would be level and there would be equality between the sexes. In another example, she writes, in his book, Is There Anything Good About Men?, Roy Baumeister blames feminism for this dynamic. And she quotes him saying, from reading feminist accounts of gender politics, one gets the impression that men and women have been collective enemies throughout history and still are. Baumeister provides no citations for these unnamed feminists, so the reader doesn't know what feminist accounts he is referring to, but his personal opinion is at odds with the empirical research studies we have examined here. So it seems that Roy just spends a lot of time making stuff up without sources, misunderstanding key terms, and I just wouldn't trust much of what he says on this topic at all. I read more of his book actually just to see some more of what he says, and while he admits that in no society on earth today are women fully equal to men, in every country in the world men rank higher than women. Women always have an inferior place. Moreover, it has for the most part always been thus as far back as we have evidence. I don't like the way he writes, but anyway. He goes on to say, feminist theory accused men of plotting against women. Men banded together to push women down. The imaginary feminist has a quick answer ready for any questions about the origins of gender inequality. Oppression. So once again, and throughout his entire book, he just misunderstands even the basics of what feminists say about oppression, patriarchy, and misogyny. Another part of his book says, it has become conventional wisdom to explain these events as based on the idea that men banded together to exploit and oppress women. At some point during the prehistoric era of gender equality, supposedly there was a conspiracy by men to seize power for themselves and push women down. There is essentially no record of such a conspiracy or historical change. The imaginary feminist likes to say that part of the male conspiracy included erasing it from history so it would never be known. And he talks a lot about, the imaginary feminist as though, he's trying to belittle feminism. But in reality, it is an imaginary feminist because no actual feminist believes this. It is nonsense. It is a blatant straw man fallacy. No one believes there is a conspiracy by, a select few men to say, ooh, let's suppress women. No one believes that. It's a very bizarre book by Roy. If you'd like me to go into more detail about it in a future video, I can do. But Yeah, I think it kind of makes sense that Rachel is referencing him and quoting him and believes his nonsense because, in some ways it's just as crazy as her book. But anyway, let's get back to Rachel. She then goes on to say that feminists describe chivalry as a wrongly romanticized institution of toxic masculinity. They certainly don't want young girls daydreaming of being courted by heroic knights and treated with honor. Feminists have been famously accused of killing chivalry, so they have no choice but to paint it as a villain that needed to die. So again, this is something I actually spoke about in my last, 2 videos ago, and when I spoke about the Whatever podcast, so I won't repeat myself too much, but many feminists, including Kristen Anderson, who we just mentioned, actually argue that chivalry is simply a form of what she calls benevolent sexism, which may seem positive on the surface, but actually hinges on assuming that women are simply weaker and more incapable, and therefore in need of protecting by men. So I wouldn't say that feminists have necessarily killed chivalry, but I think they're just more in favour, or we're more in favour, of human decency rather than just assuming women are going to be weaker, you know? Respect other people, care about other people, look after other people, but don't do it because you assume they're weaker than you based on how they appear, Simple as that. Rachel then tries to downplay the witch trials, and this is absolutely wild because I guess in her mind, 30 to 60,000 people dying because of misogynistic hysteria isn't a big deal. And then she also throws into this what seems to be a little anti-Semitism too. This is actually a pattern that you'll notice throughout the book. I was telling one of my friends about this the other day. I was like, she's quite subtle in the way she seems to hate Jewish people, but not subtle in a traditional sense, just subtle for Americans these days. She's not doing Nazi salutes, but at the same time, it's she'll list off supposed negative characteristics of people and be like, oh yeah, he scammed so-and-so out of this much money, and then he kicked a cat, and he was Jewish. And it's whoa, hang on, one of those is not like the others. And she always kind of lists being Jewish as almost a negative trait, and it's okay, that's a bit dodgy there, love. So she writes, feminist academia has done a good job of portraying Christian persecution of witchcraft and its practitioners as hysterical, superstitious, ignorant, sadistic hatred of women. Hollywood, with its obvious Jewish influence, has helped perpetrate this anti-Christian, anti-male bias by producing numerous movies and TV shows portraying witches as mysterious and misunderstood threats to patriarchal power, and the men who persecuted them as fools who were merely scared of female sexuality to such a degree they became paranoid mass murderers of women who deviated even slightly from cultural norms. She then goes on to say, they see it as a religious superstition and injustice. While I agree there were some bizarre Inquisition methods and most definitely wrongful convictions and deaths that would be considered an unduly harsh penalty in modern times, things like abortion and sex magic would have been obvious violations of law in a Christian monarchy. Therefore, it seems disingenuous at best to frame persecutions of witchcraft practice as superstitious hysteria on the part of knuckle-dragging Christian cavemen. So basically, she then goes on to go on about how, some of the women who were accused of being witches were midwives who performed abortions, so they deserved to be put to death and tortured and so on. And she's like, okay, yeah, some of the accusations might have been wrong, but most of them deserved it as a punishment for being sinners. I cannot seriously believe that there is a woman alive today who is actually supporting the witch trials, because that's what she's doing. She is pro-witch trial. She's saying, actually, yeah, these women deserve to die. What the hell is wrong with her? Like I say, she goes on to write that while some women were falsely accused, most, she claims, were not. And it couldn't possibly have been misogyny fueling this, because what about women who weren't witches? Were they burnt at the stake for merely participating in any traditionally male activity? Were they drowned for leaving the kitchen without a baby on each hip? Well, no, they were not. Except she's wrong. I mean, okay, not quite extreme, but... So, first up, there's so much to correct here. First up, people accused of witchcraft generally weren't burnt at the stake anyway. That is a myth, and suggests to me that she actually did very little research on this topic before writing about it. Generally, witches were hanged or thrown in water tied up to see if they would float or drown. If they floated, they were witches and they were hanged anyway. If they drowned, then they were innocent but they were dead. Some bodies of witches were burnt in Scotland, but only after they were already dead from hanging. There were a couple of cases of burning supposed witches, but it was very, very rare. And sadly, this barbaric practice of putting women on trial, essentially, did continue outside of witch trials, and sometimes literally for the reasons that Rachel is claiming never happened. So a few years back, I took a trip to Canterbury and made a video there about some of its history, including what is called its ducking stool, which is a chair that is suspended over the river, which at the time was absolutely disgusting, right? This river was filled with sewage, waste, dead animals. It absolutely stunk. It was teeming with bacteria. And this ducking chair could be moved up and down the river, and people could pay to have someone that they didn't like ducked in the water and held under for an amount of time. Occasionally, a businessman might use this to punish another businessman who maybe wasn't paying his debts, but more commonly, and this was how it mostly made its money, it was used by men to punish their wives. If she'd been nagging too much, if she hadn't cleaned the house properly, if she spoke back to her husband, if she dared to have a child outside of marriage or look at another man in the wrong way, she would get ducked in this grubby, stinking river. It was a punishment designed to humiliate and degrade mostly women, which sometimes resulted in accidental deaths if they were held under too long or they caught some sort of infection while they were under there. It was also sometimes just used as a threat, so men could pay a little bit less to have it just subtly moved outside their homes as a warning to their wives and daughters. So actually, yeah, some women were literally drowned and punished for simply leaving the kitchen. She then starts listing off famous feminists who were known for pushing back against the patriarchy, and literally says things like, "Are we to believe that this was some strange exception made by otherwise brutal and merciless patriarchy, or is it a clue that maybe things were not quite the way feminists had portrayed? I suppose this is yet another unexplained exception to the rule of keeping all women as domestic slaves at the time. Another explanation, of course, is that there was no vast, inescapable conspiracy by men to keep women down, but it was more practical and enjoyable for most women to raise children and enjoy working in their homes and communities while the men went to war, engaged in politics, and performed other tasks not yet made possible for women by modern technology." So she's claiming because feminists existed, that means no women were ever oppressed. And, it couldn't just be that they were the exceptions. It's that, it was their choice, and every woman had this choice, except they didn't. We know that these women are the exceptions because they were often outspoken about the oppression that they'd faced earlier in their lives, or the oppression faced by other women. They spoke out about it. She's like, we never hear from the women who were supposedly oppressed, do we? So they must not exist. Not realizing that the reason we didn't hear from them is because they weren't allowed to speak out, weren't allowed to vote, weren't allowed to learn to read or write or have their views published or, weren't allowed to speak to the masses. She lists people she's like, oh, look, we had female authors who did this and this and this and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but what about people like the Bronte sisters or George Eliot who had to publish their writings under male pseudonyms? Sure, they got published, but only by pretending to be male. Then there's a whole chapter of Rachel accusing everyone who is a different type of Christian to her of being in a cult. We'll skip over that, it's a lot. And then she speaks out about an early feminist book which mentioned both women's oppression and slavery, and she says that drawing a parallel between oppression of women and oppression of blacks and natives was to become another theme of women's liberation, tying it in with abolition and declaring white men the oppressors of everyone. This concept continues today in the idea of intersectional feminism, even though women and blacks have the same legal rights as white men. So she's now downplaying systemic racism in today's society too. It's disgusting. I don't understand. I don't know if she's just willfully ignorant, or is she just dumb? I don't know. Yeah, okay. On paper, and this is something I've spoken about many times now, on paper you can say, yes, black people have the same legal rights as white people. Women have the same legal rights as men, but this doesn't mean it's enforced, and this doesn't mean it happens in practice, And often, when we have this kind of systemic oppression and systemic racism and systemic misogyny and stuff, it's not always obvious that someone is being oppressed or not having the same rights as other people. It's often these unconscious biases. It's often, I think one of the stats I've spoken about before is how while statistically white men and black men both commit the same amounts of violent crimes, Black men are arrested and prosecuted and sent to prison and have longer prison sentences than white men. Technically, the law is saying they should all be equal, so why is it, in practice, black men are being punished more? Simply systemic racism, unconscious biases. And you need to point that out and understand that it's happening to be able to fix it. You can't just bury your head in the sand and say, well, the law says it on paper, it should be happening, so if it's not, I'm just going to ignore it. You can't do that. She's ridiculous. Chapter 4 is titled From the Seance Table to the Suffrage March. And she writes, it's been said that there was hardly a suffragist who never sat at the seance table. This is certainly true, yet not often talked about. And I was like, I'm going to need a source for that, please. She then goes on to make another unfounded claim that it would certainly not lend any credibility to the cause of feminism if the public were to learn that many, if not most, of the heroes of women's suffrage were essentially the same as the frauds you used to see on late-night television ads offering to give psychic readings via 1-900 numbers for $9.99 a minute, but I can demonstrate that they were the 19th century equivalent of exactly that. So sure, there have always been mediums and psychics, who I personally don't believe are real, and that it is all a trick, but Rachel seems to be forgetting that a lot of them were actually men too. Like, literally just Google psychics in the 19th century, and the top ones that all come up are just men. Well, mostly, a couple of exceptions, but it's like man. It's also completely untrue that the majority of feminists were scamming people as psychics. That's not even close to being true. However, there is a grain of truth in all this, and that is that the majority of mediums, maybe not necessarily some of the most famous ones, but the majority of mediums were women, and women were also the primary consumers of this, and there is a really interesting angle to consider here. So Rachel wants to try and seriously argue that feminist women, like including myself, including many of you watching or listening to this, we are inherently evil and in league with the devil, so of course we all go to seances, and feminists have always gone to seances, because we're just awful people and we want to commune with evil demonic spirits. That's who we are. But there's a more obvious reason, as put forth in Pam Grossman in her book Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic and Power, great book by the way. She writes, spiritualism was a social phenomenon. Because it was informally organised with no single governing body, estimates of the number of spiritualists during its peak in the 1850s and 1860s vary widely, from 45,000 to 11 million in the US alone. But what is clear is that it was driven in large part by women. During this period, high death rates of young children and Civil War soldiers alike cast many mothers and wives into a state of perpetual bereavement. Grief became more public, thanks in part to Queen Victoria, who famously wore black during the 40 years after her husband Albert passed. Spiritualism offered comfort to the living and consolation that their beloved family members were still with them and able to be reached, heard from, and seen in ghostly photographs. So sorry, Rachel, it's not that women are just inherently more evil and feminists are inherently evil. It's that these women were more likely to be grieving and in pain and seeking comfort. Pam also argues that this career was mostly dominated by women because, and I quote, spirit mediumship became one of a very small set of professions available to women. It gave them the ability to make money and have public influence no matter their economic background. So again, it's not that these women were evil, devil-worshipping scammers who wanted to hurt people. It's that they had very few other options, and so they took the options that they could have for independence and making money and comforting themselves and others. There's actually a quote from Anne Broad in Pam's book, which says, spiritualism became a major, if not the major, vehicle to spread women's rights ideas in the mid-19th century America. While not all feminists were spiritualists, all spiritualists advocated for women's rights, which is something Rachel can't seem to get her head around, and she accuses all feminists of being pretend psychics who are scamming people, but also communing with the devil, but also communicating with the devil regularly. Scammers, but also devil worshippers. We can be both, apparently. So sure, there was an overlap between spiritualism and feminism. We can't deny that. But is it any wonder? Where else at the time could women gather freely together, usually without men, and speak so freely to each other about what they were feeling, what they were thinking, what they were missing in their lives, what they needed and wanted from the future? It makes sense that these spiritualist gatherings offered a safe place for women. Rachel goes on to complain about Victoria Woodhull, who was a medium and carnival show clairvoyant in the mid-1800s and a very complicated character, although Rachel doesn't portray her as such. Rachel simply paints her as a fraud and a scammer, saying that her and her husband never stayed in one place for long, as the locals soon caught onto their phony tonics and messages from the dead. Rachel writes with an undertone of disgust about Victoria divorcing her alcoholic husband and remarrying before starting to publicly advocate for free love and saying that marriage was nothing more than a socially sanctioned form of prostitution. Victoria apparently said, "From that moment there will be no intercourse except such as desired by women. It will be a complete revolution in sexual matters." And Rachel summarises this as saying intercourse not willed and initiated by the woman was rape in Woodhull's analysis. Which, yeah, that's true. If both parties aren't consenting, that is rape. She was right. If it's not willed by either party, that is rape. And yet Rachel kind of mocks this. Wild. She then writes about Victoria and her sister working for this rich millionaire as his psychic. And you know what? Good for them. The rich exploit enough people, might as well do the same back to them, right? I can't be mad about it. But Rachel is shocked and appalled by this. She says, "I must take pause here to express my shock at the fact so many modern feminists who write about Woodhull, practically falling over themselves with worship and praise of her pioneering fearless feminism, gloss right over this whole story as though it's an adorable tale of good luck or a talented psychic helping a railway mogul manage his finances. I apologise for coming off as a skeptic, but am I really supposed to just believe that this was all on the up and up?" Well, it turns out that Woodhull's hot trading tips did not come from ghosts, but from a friend of hers named Josie Mansfield, who was a prostitute whose clients included wealthy Wall Street bankers and Vanderbilt's business rival Jim Fisk. So it seems obvious that the sisters were guilty of insider trading and monumental fraud. And again, you know what? This might not be the most ethical thing to do, but in a world where women were constantly the ones exploited by men, I don't blame a few of them banding together and using what little power and influence they had to do something kind of beneficial to everyone. Except Jim Fisk, but he was dodgy as hell, so there's that. Here's what's odd. Rachel says, "In all my research for this book, I did not come across a single feminist who called Victoria Woodhull and her sister what they really were. Top-tier con artists, scammers, thieves, and cheats." So, I read the book Scarlet Sisters, Sex, Suffrage, and Scandal, where feminist author Myra McPherson writes all about Victoria and her sister and tells us some interesting facts that Rachel leaves out. So it turns out that Vanderbilt had actually lost most of his wealth on some bad investments in the stock market because three men, Gold, Jim Fisk, and Drew, had all banded together to do some insider trading first, which has lost Vanderbilt all his money. So when Victoria and her sister Tenny started working for him and learning from him and eventually started trading themselves too because they wanted to become stockbrokers, they set up their own company which included a private back room and entrance just for women who wanted to trade stocks, and that was super damn progressive at the time. Rachel doesn't mention any of that. There is, however, no mention of Rachel and Tenny helping with any insider trading, so I think, it's fair, like it wasn't in this book. I did a little digging elsewhere. The only source because let's be honest, if there was insider trading, they were just helping this guy get his money back from the people who already did insider trading to scam him out of it in the first place. But anyway, the only source I could find for this idea that they worked with this prostitute who's involved with Jim Fisk was in a book by Barbara Goldsmith called Other Powers, The Age of Suffrage, Spiritualism, and the Scandalous Victoria Woodhull. And while she doesn't call herself a feminist author, she's not anti-feminist or anything either. So she's just a historian. So all Barbara actually writes of this is several times a day, Fisk sent a messenger to Josie's house with notes outlining his plans. Woodhull was to observe of Mansfield that she obtained not only Fisk's money, but that she also participated in his business secrets. He concealed nothing of his business plans and aspirations from her. Although both women denied any business association, there is little doubt that for a price, Josie Mansfield shared these plans with Victoria Woodhull, and on the client register of Woodhull, Claflin and Co., a Wall Street investment firm formed in the winter of 1869, there was listed a H.J. Mansfield. Josie Mansfield's given name was Helen Josephine. But, again, there's no specific source given for where this information came from. So we have one author saying we don't know that this happened. They denied it happening, but I think it could have happened. And here's a little evidence that, like, you know, is circumstantial and puts them in place. And Rachel has read this and gone, oh my god, they were notorious scammers who were intentionally hurting people, and everyone is trying to cover it up on purpose. Hey, so editing me here, because I'm not sure if I entirely made this section of the video clear about what the different sources were saying and how they all lined up. So basically, Rachel Wilson was claiming that without a doubt, they definitely did insider trading in order to help get money for this millionaire that Victoria initially worked for. However, the source that I can find that talks about the possibility of insider trading only says that she doesn't know if it happened, but she personally believes it's likely, but doesn't provide any source or evidence for that, and there's no guarantee it actually happened. And she writes with the implication that they were making money for themselves, because at this point Victoria and her sister had opened up their own stockbroker company, and the woman that they thought was giving them tips was registered as trading with the company herself, so she thought they were making money for themselves. However, other sources show that the man who Victoria was initially working for, who taught her how to trade in the first place, was scammed out of a lot of money by Jim Fist because he was doing insider trading. However, there's no evidence or sources or claims in other books. There was one that I read, but I read like quite a few on this topic. There's no claims in other books that they were doing any insider trading, just that they gave him tips at first and then he taught them how to trade, and then they set up their own stockbroker company. Does that make sense? I hope that's clearer. I don't know if I've entirely made it clear. The point is, it's all very complicated and different people are saying different stories, and I don't think we're ever really going to know what the exact truth was. But I do think the one thing that's clear from all the sources is that Victoria and her sister weren't intentionally trying to scam a sweet, innocent little old man out of a lot of money. They were, if they did do insider trading, they were just taking money back from an already corrupt millionaire, which again, I'm not exactly against. I'm just gonna say it. It feels like an overreaction on Rachel's part. But even if they did do this insider trading, based on all the context that we know, I'm kind of not mad about it, you know? And again, I kind of think that all the good they did in general, like setting up stockbrokers that women could go to, like, because that was unheard of at the time, that was massive. They did that, they did like a crap ton more feminist stuff, like they did a hell of a lot of good for women. And I think painting them only as scammers and inside traders is doing them a disservice, because like I don't think any person should be defined by like one instance in their life, especially when you're not given context to it. But anyway, Rachel claims that people are intentionally covering this up because they know that to divulge the insider tip would discredit the image of not only Woodhill, but the entire first wave feminist movement. And I'm sorry, but what? How? No. So two sisters and a friend of theirs did some insider trading, and now no women should be allowed to vote or have rights or own land or have their own bank accounts. Is that what you're trying to claim? Because that is ridiculous. Anyway, Rachel goes on to write about how Victoria and her sister then started their own newspaper, which was groundbreaking because it featured the first ever English version of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. And they also used this newspaper to write about feminism, which Rachel absolutely hates. And they also wrote about things like being vegetarian, which Rachel absolutely hates and is equally as angry about. It's super strange. Like, based on what I can tell in this book, the worst things a person can be are 1, a feminist, 2, Jewish, and 3, vegetarian. She hates them all, and I don't know why. Rachel glosses over a lot of the details here and leaves out some other fascinating information too, but thankfully I read some other books which do tell us. So Pam writes in Waking the Witch that suffragists that suffragettes and socialists alike would come to renounce Woodhull, considering her too controversial and attention-hungry, and even points out that she was a complicated, even contradictory individual. She was anti-abortion, but when she got older, she would rail against promiscuity and expose certain spiritualists as frauds, but the fact remains that she was a pioneer in so many areas of women's liberation and light years ahead of her time. So, like I said in the beginning, she's a super complicated figure, and she wasn't even fully accepted by other feminists at the time. And I think it's important that as feminists today, we can look at her work and the work of other feminists and say, hey, this thing they did was great. This other thing they did, maybe not so great. Because ultimately, feminists are humans too. Complex humans who change and grow and sometimes do the wrong thing. At one point, she was going along with everything and married and, doing the traditional thing. And then she was like, no, I don't want this. I'm all about free love and doing whatever. And then as she got older, she was like, oh no, actually I'm not about that anymore. I'm against that. That's 3 big changes in her life of like the ideology, but Rachel isn't portraying any of that. She's just saying, oh, what a harlot. Ugh. You know what I mean? And it's doing her a disservice, giving the reader inaccurate information. I have to admit, I didn't know a huge amount about Victoria before making this video and doing all this research and reading a bunch of books about her. So I guess, in some ways, some good has come out of reading this bad book by Rachel. And that's that it always teaches me to make sure to fact check properly, check sources, and I always find myself learning something new along the way. So I think that's really important. If you'd like to read more about Victoria Woodhull and her sister, I will leave some book recommendations in the source list as always. She then spends several pages listing off women that she doesn't like, just so she can say how none of them were real Christians, unlike her, of course. This includes several attacks on, actually, men as well, surprisingly, including people like L. Frank Baum, who wrote the Wizard of Oz books, and, the other books in that series, and also his wife and his mother-in-law. But chapter 4 gets boring, so let's skip over some of the boring bits, and also there's a lot of repetition in there that she says later. So let's move on to chapter 5, in which Rachel gets mad about women having the right to vote. She writes that most people are at least somewhat familiar with a few of the more famous suffragettes and their various actions in securing the vote for women. Susan B. Anthony, for instance, was famously arrested and fined for illegally voting in 1872. She helped found the National American Women's Suffrage Association in the US. Many people do not know that not only were the pro-suffrage activist groups in the minority, but that there were also prominent anti-suffragist women who formed activist groups in response to the suffragettes. Few people are aware of this fact because this is another part of the history of women's liberation that is intentionally hidden. In fact, some of the most vehement opposition to women voting came from women themselves. I find their reasoning to be prescient and compelling, which is why I believe it's intentionally obscured from history. No, I think it's always been common knowledge that some women oppose the right to vote, but most people don't want to give credit to the people actively arguing for oppression, I've never understood being opposed to a group having a right to do something. If you don't personally want to vote, you don't have to do it. Just because you might not want to, that doesn't give you a right to try and take away that right from other people who do want their voices heard. But for these anti-suffragist women or anti-suffrage women, it was never about allowing women to choose not to vote, was it? It was all about keeping women as a whole silent and oppressed. And if anything, I find it really sad that some women are so brainwashed that they actively believe their own oppression and the oppression of other women is a good thing. This goes for people who were anti-suffrage back in the day and people like Rachel Wilson today. Also, I'm not sure where she gets this idea that we're intentionally hiding that there were people against it. We know there were people against it, but they're not worth celebrating. It's like the people who were vocal about being pro-slavery. We don't sit there and be like, oh, well, you know what, they had some good points, because they didn't. She writes that they quite accurately predicted that pushing women to enter the political sphere and the women's liberation movement in general would cause the breakdown of the family, division in marriages, and a lack of effort and focus on children and community, which had always been the main work of women until that point. They also correctly pointed out that women enjoyed greater protection and privilege under patriarchy than is afforded to liberated women. I disagree with all of this. This is absolutely insane. That said, if you really believe that women having choices leads to breakdown of the family, then maybe that family structure that you're so in support of wasn't actually that strong in the first place, was it? If it's so good for everyone, then you shouldn't have to force women to be involved in it only because they have no other choice, should you? Funnily enough, I had one of you brilliant lot leave a comment on this exact thing as I was writing the script for this part of the video. So shout out to Heather De Silva, who said, "It's heartbreaking to see how many women don't understand what feminism is and buy into a limited history." Yes, during the suffrage movement, some women did stand up against it because they didn't want to vote, not realising it was not about forcing women to vote, and instead it was about having the right to vote if you want to. So don't want to vote? Then don't. Simple. And like I mentioned before, let's not forget there were also people who were against everything from black people and people of colour getting the right to vote, people who were against the abolition of slavery, people who were pro-segregation, and so on. There have always been people on the wrong side of history. And I'm sorry, but any person who says women have protection and privilege under patriarchy is so laughably wrong, I'm not sure I can trust anything they say on any matter. Rachel goes on to write that they believed, as I do, that women are much more influential and effective outside direct involvement in governing. They also wisely asserted that the primary role of government is to protect people and property, and that men are the only ones capable of that task. Again, I cannot disagree more. I'm pretty sure I've used this example before, but if you want evidence of how good women can be in government compared to men, you just need to look at the COVID pandemic. Marianne Seichard writes about this in her book The Authority Gap, where she says, "We all saw during the COVID-19 pandemic how much more successful on average female leaders were than male ones. Globally, women only held 7% of government leadership positions, yet four of the top 10 countries which dealt best with COVID-19 were led by women." Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times looked at death rates in 13 countries led by men and 8 led by women after the first few months of the pandemic. The male-led ones had an average of 214 corona deaths per million. The female-led ones only had 36 per million. He writes, "It's not that the leaders who best managed the virus were all women, but that those who bungled the response were all men, and mostly a particular type: authoritarian, vainglorious, and blustering. Virtually every country that has experienced coronavirus mortality at a rate of more than 150 per million inhabitants is male-led." He believed that it was a question of ego. Female leaders were happy to put public health first and defer to science experts to act quickly. Most of all, they were humble. They didn't assume that their country would be fine because either they or their nation was somehow exceptional. There was no bluster or strutting, they just got down to the job, she writes. So yeah, clearly when we look at the evidence, women are just incapable of the job when they're the ones saving millions of people's lives. I'm not sure if Rachel is just talking nonsense because she hates women, or if she's projecting her own incompetence onto her entire gender, but either way, it is very harmful and completely incorrect. She actually writes, if you can believe this, "Burdening women with a task of which they are incapable is inappropriate and detrimental to women themselves." Like, as a well-educated woman who cares about myself, my community, and wider society, I am more than capable of simply voting in an election. That is neither inappropriate nor detrimental to women. Voting isn't that hard. You read the manifestos of the candidates, you weigh up which ones you like best and which policies you like best and which ones you want to support or don't want to support, you decide who you think will do the best job, and then you put a little cross on a piece of paper. That is, as I said, neither inappropriate nor detrimental to me or other women. A woman wanting a say over what happens to her, her family, her friends, and her community is completely normal. Then goes on to show us a list of 10 reasons why women in Nebraska at the time were opposed to women being able to vote. She writes, "Try to read through these points with an open mind and put aside the feminist propaganda you've been swimming in your entire life as you read them, and imagine a world where these women won out. And then ask yourself it might not be better." Poorly written, but anyway. So this list includes, number 1, because they have not lost faith in their fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers who afford full protection to the community, there being no call for women to relieve them of the task. Okay, but I have lost faith in men to protect my community and other communities, usually because they're the ones hurting my community and other communities. I understand that my experiences as an individual will differ from the experiences of others as an individual, but that's why I want to have my own say in what happens to me and my community and not allow someone else to make those decisions for me, especially if those decisions will only end up being made by men who can never understand what it's actually like to be a woman. You need everyone to be able to speak up for themselves and their own needs. You know, this actually reminds me of, I got a comment the other day, this is off script, sorry, but I got a comment the other day from this guy, it was on my, what video? It was about the Whatever podcast, and it was the bit where I was talking about, like, high rates of sexual assault and violence against women from men and that sort of thing, and this guy goes in the comments, was like, ugh, such a feminist, blah, 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 who hurt you? And, like, clearly he was trying to be like, oh, you're just, like, hurt and damaged and lashing out, and I'm like, have you not been listening to me? You want to know who hurt me? It was men. Men who catcall me every time I leave the house. Men who followed me home from nights out and literally, like, in the dark and terrified me and tried to enter my building. Men who've tried to get in Ubers and taxis with me without my consent. Men who have literally groped me and sexually assaulted me in public. Men who have committed domestic violence against me. Men who have physically assaulted me for my entire life. Men who have hurt me and my friends and my family. Like that's who's hurt me, and that's exactly what I'm trying to say. You're trying to use who hurt you as like a derogatory thing, but it's a genuine question. Men hurt me. And he replied to this comment being like, ugh, you're just using buzzwords to try and get your audience emotional. And I'm like, no, I'm not. You're not listening. These are real experiences that women have and have had and will continue to have, including myself. I'm not just making them up because they're buzzwords. I'm saying them because they're things that have actually happened to me. There's a reason why I don't trust men to protect me, because historically they haven't, and I don't believe they will. You know? The list goes on, and number 2 is because women realise that when they become voters, they will, in consequence, have to serve as jurors and be compelled to hear all the repugnant details incident to murder trials and trials for other crimes disclosing unspeakable wickedness. Jury service is abhorrent to every normal woman. This is crazy, right? I'm absolutely fine with that. I don't suppose jury duty is fun for many people, but it's a necessary part of supporting our communities, and I'm personally happy to accept that responsibility. It's fine. Also, I find it interesting that they were saying this back in the day, and yet these days, women are the largest consumers of true crime content. Interesting, isn't it? Number 3 is because in political activities there is constant strife, turmoil, contention and bitterness, producing conditions from which every normal woman naturally shrinks. Who is this normal woman you keep mentioning? Again, I see no turmoil or constant strife in being afforded a say over my own government. Wild. It's so hyperbolic. Skipping to forward number 5, and it's because when women noisily contest and scramble for public office, woman pitted against woman, they write an indictment of womankind against which all right-minded women strenuously protest. The only women against other women here are you. Seriously. Number 6 is because women can accomplish more through counselling than they can ever attain through commanding. Again, I disagree. Different women have different skills. Let the good leaders lead. 7 is because woman suffrage will not enhance peace and harmony in the home, but on the contrary, in the heat of a campaign, it is sure to bring about dissension and discord. Now, why do you think that is? Do you think it's because they understand that some women may vote differently to their husbands? Isn't that more of a reason why they deserve a say of their own and can't just put all their faith in letting men make decisions for them? And finally, number 10 on the list was because every reason supporting the claim of women to vote supports also the right of women to be consulted as to whether they shall or shall not be given the ballot. But this makes no sense, because if you allow women the right to vote, you can still choose not to. You're not having that taken away from you. But if you deny women the right to vote, you can't choose to do it. So you are having something taken away from you. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. You know, after reading all this nonsense, I sure hope that Rachel Wilson herself does not vote. You know, I've actually heard that people in America can look up whether people have voted in previous elections or not. So if anyone wants to do that and look up Rachel Wilson and let me know, I think that'd be pretty funny, because I reckon she's not leaving it up to Andrew and the men in her life. I reckon she's probably voting herself whilst being against the vote. That said, I have heard the argument from these conservative women that they totally don't want to vote, but they have to cancel out the votes of other women like me. Even though I'm not American, but you know what I mean, women like me. Guys, like, they're so damn close to getting it, but just missing the point entirely. It's frustrating, isn't it? Girls on the right, anti-suffragists were right to ask who will take care of the children. The overall number of US children under 5 with working mothers outside the home in 1900 was less than 6%. By 2012, that number had jumped to 58%. You know, If they're really that concerned about this, the men could just step up and look after the kids themselves, you know? Just saying. Also, have you noticed, she uses suffragettes and suffragists almost interchangeably. I don't think she quite knows the difference between them. But anyway, no. She goes on to write, the anti-suffragists were also right about what the future of marriage and family would look like if we instituted such sweeping societal change. By 1900, the rate of births outside marriage was 4%. By 2010, not quite a century after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the rate of out-of-wedlock births had reached 41%. There are numerous other statistics I could cite here, but I don't want to repeat too much material that is already covered in the book. And yet she still does. And most of you can look around you at the society you live in and see the results of the work of women suffragists. Yeah, I look around and I'm personally pretty damn grateful for what they've done. I like having the right to vote. I personally love not having to get married and have kids. I personally love having bodily autonomy. I personally love seeing women in positions of power and leadership and government. But that's just me. Well, with the exception of Margaret Thatcher. That was her politics and her anti-working class stance, not her gender. Rachel says suffrage was so unpopular with women in 1895 that the state of Massachusetts asked women of voting age whether they wanted suffrage. Of the 575,000 eligible women voters, only 22,204 voted yes. That's only 3.8%. Also, guys, can we take a moment to appreciate the irony of Rachel trying to argue that women shouldn't have a right to vote by quoting a study in which women voted for what they wanted or didn't want. It makes no sense. This is true. However, an article that I found written in The Atlantic in 1903 actually pointed out that it was a much higher percentage than this in western states and lower in the southern states. It also points out that the other 96% of people weren't necessarily against the vote, but many were merely indifferent. And why? Well, I'd argue it's as simple as the fact that A, they've never really considered it before because women not having power was so common. It had never previously crossed their minds and they didn't really know what they were missing. And or B, they thought it was such an impossibility that they didn't even bother to get their hopes up or want it. And or C, many of them were not in a position to speak out about wanting the vote because they were reliant on men who didn't want them to have it in the first place and they didn't want to risk their safety. We also have to remember that it was 1895, 20 odd years before women actually got the vote in the UK and the US, and so a lot can and did change in that time. By the time women did get the vote, a lot more than this 4% were in support of it. Isn't it crazy to think that over time, with education and strong outspoken leaders, the public opinions and wants and needs change? Who'd have thunk it, eh? She then goes on a rant about how women only got the vote in America because of a particular family of rich Jewish people who were apparently pushing an agenda. So again, it's a conspiracy and nothing to do with the fact that this is what real women wanted. She thinks it's big, bad, evil Jews who are forcing women to speak up for themselves. Oh my God, she's a little bit terrifying, isn't she? She writes, suffrage was not exactly a grassroots movement whose inevitability couldn't be denied. Like most social justice movements and political revolutions, the women's suffrage movement was forced upon the populace by the wealthiest, most powerful transnational elites in the world and has occult beliefs underpinning its ideology. It's weird that she genuinely believes this stuff, isn't it? I mean, we can't deny that without proper funding and popular influential figureheads, the suffrage movement wouldn't have been as influential as quickly as it was, but implying that it's an occult conspiracy by a Jewish family with money is just ridiculous. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of these occult influences that Rachel points out were, like I say, A, Jewish, which I'll be honest hints at more than a hint of anti-Semitism on her part, and B, American with no British or European or any other counterparts. So I don't understand how she accounts for the suffrage movements in the UK and other countries around the world. The story of women's suffrage in the UK is very different to that in America. Remember the Reform Act of 1832 that I mentioned in the beginning of this video? Well, according to the excellent book Rise Up Women by Diane Atkinson, she writes that the Reform Act of 1832 extended the franchise to give the vote to male persons over the age of 21 who lived in the counties and for the first time included small landowners, tenant farmers and shopkeepers and householders living in the boroughs who paid a yearly rent of £10 or more. It enlarged the existing electorate by 500,000 of 500,000 men by 300,000 new voters. The insertion of the word male was the first statutory bar to women having the vote and was a catalyst for the founding of the women's suffrage movement. One of the first people to push back against only men being allowed to vote was a Yorkshire lady of rank called Mary Smith, who Diane says, and again I quote, was dismayed by the terms of the Act which enfranchised many men and no women. She asked Henry Orator Hunt, the radical MP for Preston, to present a petition to Parliament, the first from a woman asking for the vote. Henry Hunt had opposed the Great Reform Bill on behalf of working men who were disenfranchised by its property qualifications. In the House of Commons on the 3rd of August 1832, so that early, Hunt cited several excellent reasons why every unmarried female possessing the necessary pecuniary qualification should be entitled to elect a member of Parliament. The argument put forth by Mary Smith stated that she paid taxes and therefore did not see why she should not have a share in the election of a representative. She also stated that women were liable to all punishments of law, not accepting death, and ought to have a voice in the making of them. So sure, she was also a rich woman with connections and influence, but no occult links here, no big conspiracy. She was just a regular, well, not even a regular woman, she was a rich woman, but she was essentially a regular woman who just wanted a say over her life, and she made a damn good point. And this was happening way earlier on than Rachel understands or realizes or talks about, you know? Women continued to fight and actively influence politics, especially in the UK, throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And this was, with the exception of like Mary Smith here, primarily led by a lot of working class men and women. This ultimately led to 1918, where all women over the age of 30 who met a property qualification were allowed to vote, and all women over the age of 21 were allowed to vote in 1928. It was 1928 when they finally got the same voting rights as men. This has since been lowered to the age of 18, but all that happened over time. I think Rachel really forgets that there are different countries that exist outside of America, and we have a different history, and different people have been influential in different countries. In chapter 6, Rachel goes on to talk about the impact of theosophy on feminism cannot be overstated. Even though most regular Americans probably haven't heard of it, theosophy was the perfect bridge from the radical reformers who embraced spiritualism in the first half of the 19th century to the New Age religious movements of the 20th century. If you could create a religion specifically for feminists at the turn of the century, theosophy would be the perfect recipe. Even today, almost 150 years later, women all over the West embrace at least parts of theosophy, perhaps without even realizing it. Things like tarot cards, astrology, horoscopes, and all sorts of New Age phrases and trends such as yoga, vegetarian and vegan diets, or sending good vibes to your friends are concepts that can be attributed to theosophy, bringing those things from places like India and Tibet to the New World. It offered women at the time a sense of personal power and importance that many did not get from Christianity, which dominated the West at the time. And I have to say, I do not see how this is a bad thing. But for those of you who don't know, and I actually didn't before researching this, theosophy is often categorized as a new religious movement, although its founder never actually called it a religion, but it was established in New York City in 1875. According to just like a basic read through its Wikipedia page, although the writings of prominent theosophists lay out a set of teachings, the Theosophical Society itself states it has no official beliefs with which all its members must agree. It therefore has doctrine but does not present it as dogma. The society stated that the only tenet to which all members should subscribe was a commitment to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or colour. Which honestly seems kind of nice, right? It also states theosophical groups allow their members to hold other religious allegiances, resulting in theosophists who identify as Christians, Buddhists, or Hindus, something which Rachel does not acknowledge in her criticism of it. There's also the fact that it draws heavily from both older European philosophies such as Neoplatonism and Indian religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism. I would assume from the small amount of research that I've done that, like all religious movements, it has some pros and it has some cons. And yeah, probably some feminists were part of the movement, but also plenty weren't. But the things that, like, apparently it's, you know, that are part of it, like yoga, vegan and vegetarian diets, sending good vibes to your friends, they're not bad things, you know? They're actually pretty damn good for the world and you and your body. and your friendships. I'm also going to remind you all again that this was a religious movement primarily in America, so it couldn't possibly be responsible for feminism around the globe. It is a purely American thing, but influenced by older religions from other cultures. But Rachel consistently forgets that other countries exist and have a history too. The Wikipedia page also said that the Theosophical Society had significant effects on religion, politics, culture, and society. In the Western world, it was a major force for the introduction of age and religious ideas, so I can't help but think that there are perhaps other reasons that Rachel hates it other than its apparent links to feminism, and it maybe has something to do with her racism. Just saying. I wouldn't normally use Wikipedia as a source, but honestly, I don't think we really need to go that deep with this time, and this video is long enough. Rachel went on to write, due to the heavy influence of the Hindu, India was very important in theosophy, with many of its leaders and members travelling and living there for periods of their lives. The Theosophical Society and its affiliates built schools there. I found many more connections between second-wave feminists and India as well, which I will discuss later. And again, she says this like it's a bad thing, which is bizarre to me. And here's the crux of it again. She writes, here, once again, we run into the common theme of attempting to turn Christ into just one of many teachers rather than the sole salvation of mankind. So she really doesn't like any religion or lack of religion, which is not her specific idea of Christianity. It's intolerant on her part. And I say this as someone who is often critical of the extreme aspects of many religions, and yet I'm still completely accepting of the good parts of them too, and I'm not going to criticise someone for a belief that doesn't hurt anyone, you know? Rachel is not like that. She just doesn't seem to like anyone who isn't her type of Christian. She goes on to write, feminists were drawn to the occult specifically because of its rejection of patriarchy and the possibility for women within the occult to gain power and status. And again, I don't agree that like all feminists believe in the occult, because I know I don't, I know many of my friends don't, but again, I don't see how this is a bad thing. Rejection of patriarchy, possibility for women to gain power and status, they are good things, you know? She goes on to pick out individual feminists again, this time naming Florence Farr, who was apparently, in Rachel's words, pro-prostitution and advocated for eugenics and sterilisation, and therefore Rachel tries to present this as being true of all feminists for some reason. You know, I mean, the eugenics thing, yes, that is something to criticise, that is pretty awful. However, despite Rachel saying, she had this belief and it was a bad thing, it's glossed over in the entire book in favour of statements like this. In this book, she also advocates for eugenics and sterilisation. Florence Farr moved to India in 1912 to teach at a women's college. There she died of cancer at the age of 56 and received a Hindu burial. It's fascinating to me personally that such a famous, well-connected woman, who was a prolific writer on women's liberation, was an occult priestess known for her ability to summon powerful demons, and nobody talks about it. So, eugenics and sterilisation gets one throwaway line, and instead she goes on and on and on about how this woman is apparently an occult priestess and a demon summoner. Like, she cannot genuinely believe this woman was a demon summoner. Like, there's plenty of things to criticise, but being a genuine demon summoner is not one of them. Sorry, I can barely talk. Giggling here. And this is not the only time she accuses a feminist of being a demon summoner. Later she says, just as in the case of fraudster medium Victoria Woodhull, it seems sensible if you're trying to convince mainstream Western women to adopt feminism, you probably want to leave things like demon summoning out of the story of feminist heroes. Or maybe it's left out because, I don't know, demon summoning isn't actually a real thing that people do. Demon summoning is not real, Rachel. Come on. Oh my god, I can't believe she spends longer complaining about demon summoning than eugenics. It's ridiculous. So Rachel also has nerve to call out other feminist writers like Alice Bailey because, on a personal note, I have to say I find Bailey's writing to be the most annoying of all the feminist and occult literature I've read. She tends to repeat herself and include an obnoxious number of bulleted lists in her writings, says the woman who repeats herself constantly in this book. Like, I've cut out most of the repetition in this video because it's ridiculous. This is a 140-page long book, and it didn't even need to be this long. Like, the amount of repetition is insane. I've already seen most of these theosophy rants that we're talking about now in chapter 4, and now again here. It's just, she has so little to say and she just keeps going. It's funny because sometimes people say that of me. But overall, her whole point here is that because Alice believed in New Age stuff like astrology and also supported the United Nations forming, this means that there is indeed a spiritual, esoteric element to the UN. Do you hear that, guys? International peace and security is the work of the devil. It is spiritual. It is occult. It is supported by demon summoners. Boo peace. Boo! You can't make this stuff up, can you? I find it so hard to believe that a grown adult woman actually believes this stuff. Anyway, she goes on to suggest that any woman who believed in Theosophy's teachings at the time these women were indeed engaging in contact and cooperation with some type of entity, which begs the question, what kind of entity? And what was their motivation? I certainly wouldn't be the first to suggest that these were likely demonic entities. She goes on to say that feminist academics either conveniently ignore these women's claims of automatic writing or intentionally obscure them. As I stated before, the primary goal of feminists in academia is to paint all their heroes as brilliant, courageous, and most of all credible. Any truth-telling about the frauds and forgeries of the spiritualist medium suffragettes or the claims of the divinely inspired telepathic writings of theosophists would undermine or even destroy the credibility of first-wave feminism, which is exactly why I detailed them at length in this book. Or perhaps it's just that we know that things like tarot reading, spiritual mediums, telepathic writing stuff aren't real, so we don't claim they were possessed by the devil, but instead just set that aside and say, okay, despite these perhaps irrational beliefs at the time, let's take a look at what a positive or negative influence they had on society at the time. You know, we can understand that, like, the spiritualist movement was good for feminism. It was good for women. It gave them a place where they could speak up and gather and, you know, talk about things that actually matter to them. We can understand that that is a positive thing without having to believe that the spiritual stuff was real, you know? It's not a cover-up. It's just understanding nuance and history, which is something Rachel cannot do. Chapter 7 opens with her saying that women's need for birth control wasn't actually about bodily autonomy, but was just purely eugenics. Just as we saw most feminists in the 19th century involved in spiritualism, in the 20th century we see most feminists involved with eugenics, abortion, and birth control. One of those things is not like the others. Now, it is true that there was a small fringe group of feminists known as eugenic feminists, but they basically disappeared after around 1930 as they started to disagree more and more with actual eugenicists. Feminists being into eugenics, though, today and throughout the rest of the 20th century, not very common at all. Rachel goes on, however, to bring up Margaret Sanger, because if she had one negative view, that means that everything she ever did was bad. Because again, who needs nuance? Who needs to actually understand the entire social context of something? Margaret Sanger is someone I've spoken about in videos before because she is such a complex character who had some good ideas, some bad ideas, and we can understand all of that and be as equally critical of her as we can acknowledge the good work she did. It's important to understand that not everyone is entirely evil or entirely good. Rachel says of Margaret Sanger's childhood, they also try to overplay the hardships of Sanger coming from a large family, which seems so foreign to us today, but was not at all uncommon at the time. Margaret Sanger certainly did have a negative view of being the middle child of a large family, but of course there are a great many people from such families who don't see it that way at all. My great-grandfather was one of 14 children, none of whom counted this as a burden as far as I know. This is quite obviously a matter of perspective, but in feminist academia, it is always portrayed as a negative and a hardship, mostly in order to justify abortion. Right? It's almost as though different people have different experiences, and that different experiences are actually valid. Crazy, right? It's almost like different people want different amounts of children and should be able to choose for themselves how many they have. For her to say, like, oh, well, Margaret had a negative view, but that doesn't even count. My family didn't, and that's what counts. It's just so damn ridiculous. How is this not an argument for the legalization of abortion and birth control and a woman's right to choose? Because you can see that big families are great for some and bad for others. Ugh. Margaret herself said in her autobiography about her childhood, Christmases were on the poverty line. If any of us needed a new winter overcoat or a pair of overshoes, these constituted our presents. I was the youngest of 6, but after me, others kept coming until we were 11. Our dolls were babies, living, wriggling bodies to bathe and dress instead of lifeless faces that never cried or slept. We had little time for recreation. School was 5 miles away and we had to walk back and forth twice a day as well as perform household duties. The boys milked the cow, tended the chickens, took care of Tom, the old white horse, which pulled our sleigh up and down the hill. The girls helped put the younger children to bed, mended clothes, set the table, cleaned vegetables, and washed the dishes. There's many more stories of her childhood in that book, and she says she would never want to go back and live like that again. So why not listen to her? Why not listen to the other women and children who don't want to live like that? Why not give them a choice? It's, wild. Rachel goes on to write, one of Sanger's most famous quotes is, "No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother." But something most people don't know at the time, and many still don't know today, is that Sanger likely fabricated her most famous personal account of tending to a patient suffering the effects of a botched, self-induced abortion during this time in an apparent effort to propagandize the subject. She really needs to learn how to use commas. She often publicly told the story of a woman she treated in her nursing days who died after 2 attempts at abortion, named Sadie Sachs. Sanger biographer Ellen Chasler made an effort to corroborate the story and found no evidence of Sanger ever having met or treated such a person. She couldn't find any record that the patient even existed, which should be possible given the very detailed account, including the general time and place. Other fans of Sanger have tried to find evidence supporting Sanger's tale and failed. Therefore, it is accepted among several Sanger biographers that Sanger made this up and possibly other similar stories to propagandize the issue. And you know what? Yeah, it's very common for people like writing stories like this with the goal to educate the public, to change the names of patients, or combine the stories of multiple patients together to protect their anonymity while still raising awareness of the issue. So I don't have an issue with this, because here's the thing, even if Sadie Sachs wasn't real, this was a real story that happened to so many thousands of women. We know it did happen, and often we know that even if this one particular story wasn't real, it was happening again and again and again to other women. There's multiple articles about it in journals like The Lancet. There's stories about it in newspapers and women's magazines and old diary entries and all sorts. And you know what? It still happens today. All around the world, millions of women are dying from either illegal abortions or not being able to get access to legal abortions when they need one. Even if Sadie Sachs wasn't real, she's just simply a figurehead for the millions of women that this did happen to. So I don't have an issue with this at all. She says, at this point in my research on feminism, I had already noticed a distinct pattern of lies, forgery and fraud. Given this, I wondered just how many of the dramatic assertions from feminists about the proliferation of back alley abortions were true, and how many were fear-mongering abortion propaganda. Oh my god, are you actually kidding me? So now, not only is she, like earlier in the book, she's like pro-witch trials and murdering women, and now she's like, back alley abortions weren't even real, I don't believe in them. Can't just discount the millions of women who've died this way because, I don't know, it's kind of convenient for me to not believe it. Hey, so editing me again. I'm just going to jump in here with an actual example for you, because I wanted to read you a few passages from a book by an actual midwife. So Jennifer Worth was a midwife in London in the 1950s and onwards, and she actually wrote a number of memoirs about her work, one of which ended up being the basis for the drama TV series on the BBC called Call the Midwife. But her memoirs, while Call the Midwife is kind of like a fictional adaptation of her books were memoirs. They really happened. These were her real experiences and the experiences of her colleagues and the people she worked with. So in one of her books called Farewell to the East End, and you'll have to excuse me because I'm reading off my screen up above me, she has a couple of chapters about illegal abortions in the UK, specifically around London, and people that she worked with and spoke to. And in these, she writes of a woman called Hilda seeking an abortion because the thought of a 7th baby in that horrible flat filled her with such dismay that she thought anything would be better. Jenny goes on to write, she had to be very careful. Backstreet abortions were quite common in those days, but the practice was illegal, and both the client and the abortionist could be prosecuted if caught and would face a prison sentence if convicted. Every precaution was necessary. So the abortionist that Jenny writes about in this particular story was a woman called Mrs. Pritchard, and she talks about the actual process of the abortion, saying, to the police, local doctors, church and social workers, Mrs. Pritchard was a herbalist specialising in potions known only to the mystics for the cure of hay fever, gout, arthritic knees, and so on. Her front room was filled with bottles and phials. Her premises had been inspected several times by the public health authorities, who had found her remedies and treatments to be harmless, if ineffectual. Evidence of the more lucrative side of her business was nowhere to be seen. She'd learned her trade from her mother, who had been an abortionist since the 1880s, and when the old lady died, Mrs. Pritchard had inherited the equipment which had been stolen from hospital about 50 years earlier. So because everything was completely illegal, these instruments were very old, they were really hard to clean, they were never stored in sanitary conditions because they had to be hidden away. So in this case, Mrs. Pritchard takes her abortion equipment with her. Mrs. Pritchard has taken the abortion equipment with her in literally a bag of vegetables, dirty vegetables. And Jenny wrote, Mrs. Pritchard delved among the leeks and Brussels tops and produced her instruments. They were exceedingly old and made of rough, unpolished steel, virtually impossible to sterilise, if indeed Mrs. Pritchard ever made any attempts at sterilisation. They consisted of a few ancient surgical instruments such as forceps, dilators, curettes, and a Higginson's syringe. Then there is an incredibly graphic description of what an illegal, unsafe abortion entailed. And I'm going to warn you now, this is going to be very hard to listen to, so feel free to skip ahead to the end of this section if you need to. But if you can, I want you to listen to it, because this will help you understand why these abortions were so much more dangerous than safe, legal abortions in a proper hospital or care facility are today. This is not what the average abortion today is like. I just want to make that very clear. I'm telling you the story not to demonise abortion in general, but to help you understand why we need it to be legal and safe and clean and so on. She felt with her fingers until she thought she'd located the cervix. With the forceps, she grabbed the cervix and pulled it towards her. Hilda felt a pain like a knife stabbing her body, but she managed to suppress a scream. Holding the cervix quite firmly, Mrs. Pritchard took one of the dilators and attempted to force it through the closed cervix with no success. "Too big," muttered the abortionist, and reached for a smaller dilator, which she pushed hard against the cervical orifice. Hilda felt pain like burning knives tearing her body apart. She opened her mouth to scream, but a towel was thrust in, pushing her tongue backwards and nearly choking her. Mrs. Pritchard had a curette at her disposal, so she poked with it in a blind attempt to force entry through the cervix into the uterus. When she thought she'd succeeded, she started scraping around and continued scraping until blood began to flow. The pain was so intense that Hilda passed out, and when she regained consciousness, she was vomiting, but the towel had been thrust into her mouth and was still there, so she started choking. The abortionist said, "There now, a nice flow of blood, that's all you needed, dear. A nice new broom to sweep away them stomach cramps. You'll be all right now, dear. You might feel shaky for a day or two, but it'll soon pass and you'll be fine. Now get up, dear. Yes, you can get up all right and go and lie on the bed for an hour or two. We'll do the cleaning up. It's all part of the service. I pride myself on never leaving a mess behind." So again, I just want to make it clear, this is not what an abortion today is like, or rather, this is not what a legal, safe abortion is like. There are still, sadly, illegal abortions being carried out, and they are barbaric, they are dangerous, because if they're illegal and they have to be done in secret, they're never going to be completely sterile or safe or done by people who are trained to do it safely. In the next chapter, Jenny talks more broadly about backstreet abortions, and she says, and this is where I'm going to be doing a lot of reading to you again, but I think it's important that you get this perspective from someone who worked in this field and dealt with a lot of actual women who went through this. She says, "There have always been women who wanted or needed an abortion. For rich women, it was relatively easy. A clandestine visit to a secret address, often abroad, where a doctor working in an unregistered clinic would operate illegally and usually successfully, leaving little damage to the woman. Sometimes it was possible to procure an abortion legally if two doctors, one a psychiatrist, would testify that the woman seeking the abortion was mentally and physically incapable of carrying the pregnancy to full term. It cost a lot of money, but the risk of prosecution was removed. For poor women, it was a different story. Most working-class people lived in a perpetual state of poverty. The whole family crowded into 1, 2, or at most 3 rooms, with not enough food, lighting, or heating. Contraception was inadequate, and women had too many children, far more than they could decently house or feed. Another baby was frequently a disaster. For single women, pregnancy was a catastrophe, and many preferred suicide to the stigma of bearing an illegitimate child. So, millions of women sought an abortion. The first method attempted was usually a simple vaginal douche, but this was unlikely to work because the fluid has to enter the uterus to be effective. If a caustic solution was used, it caused chemical burns to the vagina and cervix. She goes on to write, "Thousands of women tried medicinal ways of evacuating the uterus. Violent purgatives such as a pint of Epsom salts were used. Gin and ginger, turpentine, raw spirit, aloes and sloes were also employed. None of them worked. Disreputable newspapers and journals advertised what they called cures for menstrual blockage for a sum of money. These were poisonous and sometimes fatal. Quinine was commonly used, and some cures even contained arsenic or mercury. Wise women have known for millennia that the black fungal growth on rye grain will induce an abortion. It was called ergo, and was also known to cause the deadly disease commonly called St. Anthony's fire. When I was a young pupil midwife doing my theoretical training at a teaching hospital, a colleague was having an affair with a doctor and she became pregnant. She stole a bottle of ergometrine from the ward medicine cupboard and took the tablets over a period of days until she aborted. She became terribly ill, but such was her desperation that she continued working throughout. If matron had discovered that she was pregnant, my colleague would have been dismissed. If it had come to light she'd been stealing ergometrine, her name would have been removed from the register. She was an SRN, and very likely reported to the police for prosecution under the Criminal Abortion Act. And that's not the only story either. Again, Jenny goes on to tell more stories of more women. Some women tried violent methods such as falling downstairs or half drowning or taking a scalding hot bath in the hopes that they would provoke a spontaneous miscarriage. If the woman survived, she would usually still be pregnant because one would virtually have to kill the mother before the fetus could be destroyed. Driven to extremes by despair, women would go to unbelievable lengths in trying to make themselves miscarry. Knitting needles, crochet hooks, metal coat hangers, paper knives, pickle spoons, curved upholstery needles, spokes of bicycle wheels have all been forced into the uterus by desperate women who prefer to do anything rather than continue the pregnancy. And I'll remind you, Jenny is writing about this from experience. These are things that she has seen women do to themselves. These are things that her colleagues have seen women do to themselves. These aren't just propaganda for the sake of it. These are actual stories of actual women who have put themselves through this because they didn't have any other option. Jenny goes on to write, I've given talks to women's groups on the early days of midwifery. In the course of many of these talks, some lady in the audience has told us a story about a grandmother or great aunt who had induced an abortion on herself. I've heard many such stories and in diverse circumstances, and they are all so dismally similar that the oral evidence cannot be in doubt, she writes. One story related by a lady at a WI meeting will suffice. My aunt was a respectable single woman of 35 living with her mother, who was very proud of the family reputation. While on holiday, my aunt became pregnant and tried to abort herself with a crochet hook. She bled profusely, and her mother found out what was going on. The old lady was so horrified at what the neighbours might say that at first she refused to call the doctor. It was not until it became obvious that her daughter would die that in great secrecy she summoned a doctor who performed an evacuation of the uterus and suturing on the kitchen table of their home. Afterwards he said, "This must not go beyond the walls of this house. No one but we three will know what has happened tonight." The story was not told in the family for 40 years. That doctor had saved the woman's life, but he had risked his career in doing so. Had the story become known and his name reported to the General Medical Council, he would have been brought up before a disciplinary committee for professional misconduct. I don't understand how Rachel can hear stories like this of actual people who have been through this and their family members have been through this and still suggest that none of it actually really happened. It's all just fake. Like, does this not break your heart? I'm gonna go on, there's more to read. Jenny writes, the alternative to attempting to make oneself miscarry was to visit an illegal abortionist, like we saw in the last chapter. Backstreet abortionists favoured one of two methods, the surgical procedure or the flushing out method. Both are highly dangerous and only a doctor trained in surgery is competent to conduct an abortion. However, that did not stop countless numbers of women practising for a fee. They had a vague idea of female anatomy and operated with improvised instruments such as those described, or with obsolete instruments stolen from a hospital, like in the last chapter. There was no sterility, no anaesthetic, no proper lighting, and operations frequently took place on kitchen tables. It's easy to push a metal object into the vagina, but the cervix lies at a nearly 90-degree angle to the vaginal wall. Without surgical knowledge, the instruments could easily miss the cervix and go straight through the vaginal wall. Working blind, abortionists have been known to push a sharp object into the bladder or rectum. If the instrument did enter the uterus, it was sometimes pushed right through and out the other side. Even if these hazards were avoided, bleeding was frequently uncontrollable. And again, she goes on to tell another story. At a talk I gave to the East London History Society in 2006, and again, I'm going to say this, look, 2006, so this isn't crazy propaganda because it's already legal at this, well, not quite as legal as it might be, but it's already legal at this point, so this isn't fictional propaganda, this is just a genuine story. So, 2006, a woman in the audience told us that in the 1930s, in the small Essex village where she was born, there was a bona fide midwife who was also an abortionist. She was a good practitioner, experienced and respected. A mother in the village came to her and said that her 14-year-old daughter was pregnant and begged her to carry out an abortion. The woman did not want to, but the mother pleaded so earnestly that eventually she agreed. The flushing out method was used, and the girl died on the table. Mother and abortionist were sent to prison. Again, are we to believe that she's just making this story up as well, even though in 2006 she has absolutely no reason to? Do we suppose she faked criminal records to go along with it? Is that what Rachel thinks? It's insane. She says of her own experience, as nurses and midwives, we often had to clear up the mess after a bungled abortion, especially when we worked on gynecological wards. The outcome for these women was frequently chronic ill health. Conditions such as anemia, scar tissue with adhesions, prolapse with chronic pain, incontinence, cystitis, or nephritis could be expected along with many others. Thrombosis of the leg was not uncommon, and this clot could travel into the bloodstream lodging in the lungs. Anticoagulants were not available until the 1950s. I've seen much mutilation and 2 deaths. The first was of a girl of 19 whose internal mucosa and cervix had been burned by a carbolic acid or some other caustic solution used during a flushing out abortion. There was little we could do, and she lingered for a while, but she was in constant agony and died after a few days. I recall another tragic woman, the mother of 5, developed a massive sac of pus in the peritoneum after a surgical abortion. We tried to drain it without success, and for many weeks pus oozed from her abdomen. The 5 children coming into hospital just before their mother died can never be forgotten. Jenny ends this chapter by writing that the Criminal Abortion Act of 1803 was repealed in 1967. Knowing that I'd been a midwife, I was sometimes asked if I approved or not. My reply was that I did not regard this as a moral issue, but as a medical one. A minority of women will always want an abortion, therefore it must be done properly. And I really respect that she ended on that, because I think it's such an important thing to remember. It's not a moral issue, it's a medical issue. This is medical care that women and people with uteruses will always need. Whether you want to have an abortion or not is a personal choice, but there should always be an option for it to be done legally and safely and affordably. So I don't know, I felt like while I was editing this video, I realised that I hadn't really told any real stories or read anything out from people who'd actually experienced this or worked with these women, and I felt it was important to share, because if Rachel's making these big claims about how, oh, these people are just making it up, it's not real, I felt the need to actually respond to that and be like, well, actually, no, it is very real. Here's some real stories. How can your heart not go out to these women? You know? Anyway, thanks for listening to me while I'm all messy like this. The World Health Organization found that 45% of the 73 million abortions which happen worldwide every year are unsafe. Over 7 million people in developing countries alone were hospitalized due to complications from unsafe abortions in 2012, and the mortality rates due to unsafe abortions were at least 200 per 100,000 abortions, although it's believed this figure is actually a lot higher. As the World Health Organization states, maternal deaths due to abortion, and more specifically unsafe abortion, are often misclassified and underreported given the stigma. That is millions of women becoming ill and dying because of unsafe abortions today. Imagine how many it was back then when it was illegal in way more places. Do they really think we're just making up all these dead women for the lols? No, they're real and they matter. And even if it wasn't in the millions, even if it was just a few thousand or hundred, or their deaths would still matter, because we can prevent them, and we should. And while we don't have the exact stats for the numbers of arrests and convictions of people having and performing illegal abortions in the early 1900s and before, we do have records of at least some of them, and we know that they did happen. We know that women died. We know that doctors and midwives were convicted of causing the deaths of both fetuses and mothers. We know this is a fact. And yet Rachel still goes on to claim, abortion rights activists have indeed been engaged in falsifying and exaggerating a great deal of facts and figures about abortion prior to Roe v. Wade, if not imagining them altogether. The often repeated trope about the desperate woman seeking back alley abortions performed by unskilled, untrained hacks is false. Before abortion was made legal in 1973, 90% of abortions were performed by physicians, and almost all the rest were performed by midwives. Yeah, and a lot of them were arrested for it. Just saying. I actually can't believe I didn't look this up before, but I read her source for where she got the stat from, and it's a book from from 1970, that is just so chock full of misinformation. I've only skimmed a couple of chapters and already seen so much misinformation in there, and her just blatantly making up stats, like, and quoting people saying, well, I don't know if this was true back then, but I feel like it can't possibly be true now. I'm in such a rush today, you're coming with me while I pick up my grocery delivery. But basically, the other thing about this being in like 1970 is that there was still so much stigma around abortion then. If you take the UK, for example, it had only been legal for, 3 years? Something like that? So there's so much stigma. So obviously a lot of the deaths around it were still being covered up. We didn't know the full extent of it. People weren't talking about it. More modern sources today, there's still stigma in a lot of countries, but a lot less of it. So the numbers are more accurate. And she likes to talk about how, well, it's not thousands in America, it's only hundreds. And I'm like, those hundreds still matter, even if it is much lower. But I don't think it is. Right, so sorry if this is a bit disjointed, but basically, in summary, the stats that we have today are from health organisations whose only agenda, if you will, is simply to stop women and people with uteruses dying unnecessarily, to save women's lives. This book in the 70s was written by a woman who was actively anti-choice, who was spreading so damn much misinformation and just making things up off the top of her head. It's not a reliable source at all. And while I haven't read the whole book, I will admit, I've literally, like I say, just skimmed a couple of chapters. I can already see some dodgy sources that are not reliable, plenty of misinformation, and I wouldn't trust it as far as I can throw it. As I've already mentioned, prior to the medicalisation of childbirth, nearly all abortions were performed by midwives who were trained and skilled in the practice. Another egregious lie that has been repeated by the media ad nauseum for decades is that prior to legalisation, tens of thousands of women died every year as a result of those supposedly dangerous illegal abortions. And this is just blatantly false. There are still hundreds of thousands of women, millions, dying every year from illegal abortions. These women exist. Their lives matter. And since the recent law changes in America, even more women are dying there from pregnancy-related health issues because they can't get abortions when they need one because it's now illegal. I don't know how Rachel has the nerve to say any of this when women have died. Women continue to die, and you can't just pretend they don't exist. It's actually sickening. Right, I'm actually back again as I'm about to serve up food. I'm having mac and cheese, can't wait. But thank you to my mum for coming through and helping me with this. Because I've just got to the bit in editing where Rachel is making the claim that abortions weren't carried out by random people, by random women, by wise women, by local women. She's like, no, even illegal abortions were done by doctors, and it was all sterile, and no, absolutely not. My mum, as I said before, is a massive family history buff. She has traced some of our family back to the 1600s, the other side back to like the 1700s, something like that. And she's really into it. And she also traces the families of our family and friends. So like my sister-in-law's friends she worked with and stuff like that before she retired. And she sent me this amazing bunch of articles about one of her friends, June. And she had an ancestor who went to prison because she was a random woman in a Yorkshire village, a South Yorkshire village, performing illegal abortions on women in the area for the price of £3 with a crochet hook. And she finally got caught, and there was like a whole court case, and the women she performed abortions on were like, no, we don't know her, we've never seen her before, no, I don't know who this woman is. And she was like to the women she performed abortions on, no, I don't know them, never seen them before. But the police collected bloody crochet hooks from her house that were like wrapped in newspaper and all this sort of thing, and this woman ended up going to prison. So these things happen. It wasn't trained doctors. This was a random working class woman in a Yorkshire village who was just trying to help out other women in trouble who didn't have any other options, who needed her help. So, I mean, what she was doing was dangerous, but she wouldn't have to do it in such a dangerous way if it was just legal and safe and readily available. Yeah. Anyway, it's a personal story from a family member of a friend of my mum's, which I know is anecdotal, but my mum sent me all the news articles about it and stuff like that, and copies of them, and this stuff happened. It actually happened. It's, yeah. Anyway, point is Rachel's wrong. Gonna enjoy mac and cheese now. Rachel says that Dr. Bernard Nathanson, co-founder of the National Abortion Rights Action League and director of the largest abortion clinic in the world during the 1970s, later admitted that leading abortion proponents knew that this figure was false, but felt it was useful as a PR tactic. Now, Bernard Nathanson is not a reliable source of anything. He is currently a right-wing pro-life grifter who has many critics because he has made a lot of money off a series of scientifically inaccurate anti-choice propaganda films, such as The Silent Scream, which implies fetuses scream and recoil in pain inside the womb during an abortion, despite the fact that this film itself shows an abortion at the 12-week stage, where the fetus doesn't have any consciousness or sentience or ability to feel pain, and is simply a bunch of non-conscious cells that are moving around non-consciously, as most living things do, including plants. You know, it would be like seeing a plant move towards the sun and being like, oh, look, it's trying to get away from you because it doesn't like you. It's not how it works. His film is non-scientific propaganda. He only became pro-life after converting to Catholicism, and I honestly wouldn't believe a single word he said. I've got a document linked in the sources for this video, which is an interview with him, but also with other doctors who fact-check his claims and point out how wrong he is and how inaccurate a lot of his claims are. So if you're interested, you can go read that. Rachel says, it might shock you to know that in the decades since abortion was legalised, deaths from abortion have increased, mostly as a result of abortion numbers skyrocketing after legalisation. No. Reported deaths from abortion have increased. Since it was illegal before, a lot of the abortion-related deaths were covered up or not reported. How does she not realise this? There is still a considerably lower rate of death for safe, legal abortions than there ever was for unsafe abortions. Legal medical abortion is actually one of the statistically safest medical procedures a person can have. Sickeningly, Rachel then goes on to try and blame Margaret Sanger for her daughter Peggy dying while at boarding school, because she literally, this is so sick, she writes, if only she'd been there, little Peggy wouldn't have gotten so sick. Apparently the brother also blamed his mother, and Rachel implies that she does too, and Rachel's like, blah blah blah, yeah, Margaret Sanger's so bad she basically killed her kid through neglect by sending her to a boarding school. And then she goes on, blah blah blah, Sanger spoke to the devil, she dabbled in the occult, she's such a monster, blah blah blah. There's more about Sanger being evil because she was friends with lesbians, apparently, which is disgusting. How dare she, right? Be friends with lesbians. Again, glossing over the eugenics stuff and complaining more about dabbling in the occult, speaking to the devil, and knowing lesbians. Rachel has some odd priorities. She describes one of Sanger's friends and co-workers as a radical feminist who supported sexual liberation, contraception, and acceptance of homosexuality. She was a strong critic of marriage. How disgraceful. One of the last things she says is, I would, however, like to contribute my opinion as a mother of 5 children who has also suffered 3 miscarriages about how deeply Sanger affected the public opinion of motherhood in general. She had very little positive to say about motherhood, referring to it as slavery, a trap, and calling women who had more than a couple of children breeders. So for context, Margaret Sanger collected and published a bunch of letters from women who had written to her, saying that we find the confessions of women, the majority of whom have passed their 30th year, and many of whom are approaching or past 40, who have enjoyed no surcease from the endless drudgery of childbirthing, who are pathetically begging for release from the long slavery they have suffered and are still enduring. So Margaret was literally just repeating the words of women, of mothers, who were upset because they were forced into motherhood against their will. And Rachel's like, oh, how dare she repeat these words. Rachel, however, argues that this can't be real, and that these women couldn't have possibly said this stuff and written to Margaret and whatever, because I am extremely dubious about the authenticity of this book and the letters inside it. The Margaret Sanger Papers Project claims almost all of these were likely destroyed by clinics they were sent to, or by associates of Sanger, or were lost to time. They are also anonymous, so I can't imagine that you could ever prove the veracity of letters almost a century later. They all read like horror stories and are just a bit too similar, sounding like they were written by the same person or possibly exaggerated. This is just my personal perception of the book, not an accusation of forgery. Except, we see women saying this exact same stuff today. We even see men saying this same stuff today. Look at, any forum about people who regret parenthood, women and men, and mostly women, are still saying this stuff today. They're still regretting parenthood. They're still upset when they're forced into it against their will. Why can't Rachel just listen to the lived experiences of other women who feel differently to her and believe them? Why is that so hard for her? Rachel claims that Sanger seems to have disdain and even jealousy of attractive women who are seen as fit mothers by men and therefore tend to marry early and have more children. Yeah, this is what this is. It's jealousy and definitely not genuine concern for people who've told her they're miserable. Oh, I'm so tired of this, like, oh, if you're critical of something, you must be jealous of it thing. It's just really insulting to have your opinion and experience consistently undermined in this way. She says, I'm very sceptical of many of Sanger's claims of receiving hundreds of thousands of letters from women claiming to be desperate for some knowledge on how to prevent the birth of more children. I'm not. My mum found tens, maybe hundreds of women in my family, going all the way back to the 1600s who died during childbirth. Grandmothers, aunts, cousins, sisters from all branches of the family tree going back hundreds of years, and that's just in one small area of Yorkshire. Rachel goes on to write, in addition, I have some direct personal knowledge from my own grandmother, who was born in 1926 and is still alive as I write this at the age of 95. She has all her faculties intact, and I asked her about her mother and grandparents' knowledge of family planning, her own mother, who lived to be 102 years old and who I knew well, as I was 19 when she passed, had 4 children between 1922 and 1927. My grandmother tells me that her mother's doctor advised the couple on how to space out or avoid more births. There was no restriction of this information, and the couple were easily able to prevent any further births by, as Grandma put it, being careful and avoiding certain things. When I asked her about whether great-grandma was prevented from understanding how to avoid pregnancy, she said that's absurd. Dr. Lanning told her anything she wanted to know, and it obviously worked, since your Aunt Thelma was the last of us kids to be born. Yeah, and often they were just advised not to have sex at certain times, but this isn't the same as preventing pregnancy, and plenty of times people wouldn't listen. And a lot of working class families, like my own for example, didn't have easy access to doctors who would tell them this stuff. Poor women and women without an education didn't have access to this knowledge. And what about women before we really understood menstrual cycles and ovulation? What about them? There's still women alive today who don't have proper sex education or education about their bodies and their menstrual cycles, who don't know how to prevent pregnancy, even with birth control available. This is just wild. She ends the chapter by implying that any abortion provider around the world has a depopulation agenda and is actively anti-human, which is just ridiculous. She says it's naive and frankly absurd to believe that this has nothing to do with the depopulation agenda of its founders and current operators. Because she's just full of conspiracy theories, isn't she? And like I say, she barely touched on any of the actual eugenics stuff. She spent more time moaning about lesbians and demon summoning and not personally enjoying being a mother. It's wild. Next chapter, she gets mad at Simone de Beauvoir because Simone de Beauvoir believed that men not only controlled religion, but that they used it to control women, which is pretty damn accurate if you ask me. She saw Christianity was a patriarchal fantasy which most women were not educated enough to dismiss. Also true. She was also among the first to describe the gender-sex distinction which defines transgender ideology today. Smart woman. In the second sect, she says one is not born but becomes a woman. Like Margaret Sanger, she had an incredibly negative view of motherhood and did not believe in the concept of any innate maternal instinct, thus she never had any children. I can relate to that, like her already. She also advocated for a Marxist socialist communal system of raising children due to her ideas about women liberating themselves by transcending their status as wife and mother. She did not believe women's liberation was possible if women raised their children in a nuclear family setting. All sounds fine to me. I mean, I'm not going to go as far as to be like, let's get rid of the nuclear family. I'm not that extreme, but the rest of it, I think, yeah, she makes some good points. Now, there are reasons to be critical of Simone de Beauvoir, as there are with many people, as Rachel points out. De Beauvoir thought that marriage was destructive to both partners, but particularly to women, and she never married, but had several partners. De Beauvoir believed that pansexuality was ideal, as it provided maximum freedom, and that both heterosexuality and homosexuality were equally restrictive. She had several controversial affairs with women, including one with a young student of hers, French author Bianca Lamblin. Lamblin later wrote of the relationship in her book A Disgraceful Affair, where she describes being taken advantage of by the much older de Beauvoir and seduced into a sexual relationship with both de Beauvoir and her longtime male partner, Jean-Paul Sartre. De Beauvoir was also fired from a teaching job and had her teaching license revoked for seducing a 17-year-old student. It is speculated that she had other relationships with much younger female students as well. Now, I don't like Rachel's implication here that Simone de Beauvoir's pansexuality was to blame for this. It wasn't. It was just predatory behaviour through and through, and that is something to be critical of, absolutely 100%. I'm just a bit confused why Rachel is calling this out, but still supports men who are known rapists or who defend rape. It seems hypocritical to me. But Rachel's very happy to call out bad behaviour in feminists, but not in people on her side of things. But again, I think this is one of these things, isn't it, where we can be like, yeah, her academic work had merit here, and these were great points, but her personal life and behaviour, absolutely not acceptable. I think you can absolutely acknowledge both. I do actually think it's really important to often look back at the work of prominent feminist figures who got stuff wrong and try and learn from them and understand them, you know? How do we do better? How do we make sure we're not making the same mistakes? There's a really great book about this called Faux Feminism, Why We Fall for White Feminism and How We Can Stop It by Serene Kader. And she writes that many of the same feminists most of us were taught about in history books are at some point allies of white supremacy, colonialism, capitalist exploitation, ableism, cis-sexism, and homophobia. Even producing as feminist goals ideas that supported keeping these other systems of oppression in place. From Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt's very public statements that women's suffrage was compatible with and could perhaps even strengthen white supremacy, to Betty Friedan's claims that women need to free themselves from biological living, as though no one would have to pick up the slack for caring for children or cleaning houses, feminists for the few have been with us for a very long time. So I think it's important to be critical of feminists who, either intentionally or not, excluded people. And speaking of Betty Friedan, Rachel then goes on to insult her work by saying, "I like to call this book basic bitch feminist theory for the masses." In contrast to the deep existential philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan's work was far more accessible to the average American woman, which is probably why it was so successful. And yeah, like we said, there are things to be critical of in Betty Friedan's work, but I don't think this is one of them. There's nothing wrong with writing something accessible for the masses. That can be a good thing. That's how the average person learns. You can't just make them dive deep into really big, heavy, complex stuff. You need to help them start with something simple and accessible. Rachel also reduces disagreements over ideologies between Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem down to a simple cat fight, which is so demeaning and misogynistic. Again, I think there's legitimate criticisms to be made, but they aren't the ones that Rachel brings up. She then goes on for pages about Operation Mockingbird, which is still just a conspiracy theory and has not been proven to be true, but she says that Gloria Steinem was definitely part of it, working with the CIA to infiltrate and influence the media in the United States and abroad. Steinman's work in journalism and media was directed and funded by the CIA as part of an effort to liberalize Western culture, and feminism was a big part of this effort. Once again, we see that the accepted narrative of bored housewives in the West rising up in a grassroots effort to break the shackles of domestic slavery is baloney. The feminist revolution of the 60s and 70s was planned, orchestrated, and manipulated, in Rachel's mind, by the CIA. It just feels like a crazy person's ramblings, right? This is madness. Rachel starts chapter 9 talking about Terence McKenna and his machine elf hallucinations while taking certain drugs and other substances. Her main problem with Terence seems to be that McKenna was vocal about his opposition to Christianity. McKenna attempted to blend goddess worship and shamanic mysticism with the tech revolution through a theory called technological singularity. But she uses this whole section as a way to complain about people using hallucinogenic drugs and substances, which is a complex topic in its own right that Rachel does not do justice. I'm not a person who takes any of those substances myself, but I do find reading about them really fascinating. I do believe that, like any substance or drug, that they can be abused and they can be misused, but I also believe that for some people in the right circumstances, working alongside doctors and therapists, they can actually be therapeutic. That said, as an atheist and skeptic myself, I'm not going to be sitting here telling you that I believe the spiritual stuff Terence was spouting was totally real and true, because I don't believe that, but I also don't attribute it to what Rachel does. She says, much like with the spiritual mediums of the 19th century, McKenna was either deluded or he was contacting some kind of entity which some have supposed could be demonic in nature. Either way, this drug-induced enlightenment formed the basis of his teachings, which many still follow today. So, yeah, once again, she's like, oh, look, he was talking to a demon. That's her go-to theory. I'm not exactly sure what this has to do with feminism, but Rachel has a theory. Apparently, this was the starting point of his involvement with the CIA. McKenna was part of a larger movement in the 1970s among counterculture radicals to return to ancient religion in a neo-pagan movement, specifically goddess worship and different forms of witchcraft. It's possible that the widespread use of psychoactive drugs helped fuel the New Age and neo-pagan revivals of the 60s and 70s, which were so incredibly appealing to feminist activists. And there's no doubt there was a connection between feminism and both of these things long before the Cultural Revolution. And there's also the possibility that the rise of feminism and the 19th Amendment and everything else which came from it opened a literal and figurative Pandora's box, which brought about the neo-pagan revival. It's a bit of a chicken or the egg situation, but I tend to believe it has more to do with the latter. She says this, and goddess worship filled a spiritual void left by feminism's condemnation of Christianity, and it fit well with other trends of the time, including environmentalist activism, because we all know caring about the environment is evil. She goes on to write that while some feminists try and claim the goal of feminism is equality, I have a certain respect for the honesty of witches and goddess worshippers who make no bones about saying that they believe women are superior to men, with many saying women should control society rather than men, not because I agree, but because it is more honest about the real aims of feminist ideology. Ugh, but I, as a feminist, don't believe that. And I'm not a witch, and I don't believe in any gods or goddesses. So what, am I just being dishonest in Rachel's eyes, or do I not really exist? I don't know, this book is getting exhausting at this point. We're nearly done, I promise. She goes on to complain that once we accept that gay and trans people are human and deserve the same basic human rights as everyone else, then that will lead to not equality, but the downfall of humanity as a whole, and we won't even know what being human is anymore, which is just ridiculous, isn't it? This internal battle is an example of what happens when we deconstruct the foundations of society and discard all limits on morality. The result is a self-perpetuating revolution where boundaries themselves are seen as oppressive constructs which must be destroyed. What began with feminism, we now see perpetuated with gay marriage and transgenderism. Hate that word, it's not real. Both of which are just further steps in the direction of transhumanism. The deconstruction of the social order was never meant to be ended with some egalitarian notion of equality, but was meant to progress until all human boundaries disappeared, even the idea of what it means to be human at all. Oh god, she's just ridiculous. She then goes on a several-page rant about Oprah, who, I mean, I have questions about, because, you know, she's been associated with an awful lot of celebrities who we know have sexually assaulted a lot of women and children, so I have questions for her. But Rachel doesn't like her for other reasons. She claims that Oprah is too feminist, and how dare she bring feminism to the mainstream. In chapter 10, Rachel starts by talking about the negative effects for children growing up without their father, more behavioural problems, higher chance of homelessness. If their mother has a new boyfriend, then there's a whatever % chance of him being abusive to the kids. All very serious issues. And what I'm hearing here is there's negative consequences of A, fathers leaving their kids, and B, men being abusive to kids, right? So I'm seeing men do something bad and kids suffer when I read this. But what Rachel takes away from this is, see, women can't even raise kids, and therefore women bad and feminism bad. Her conclusion is not logical. She's once again blaming women for the behaviour of men. She then says, but women are happier now than they were before feminism, right? Well, not exactly. A 2009 paper called The Paradox of Female Happiness by Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers caused quite a stir when it was released by the National Bureau of Economic Research. The abstract summary of their findings says that despite objective measures of well-being in America over the prior 35 years increasing, the subjective overall happiness among women in the study has decreased both absolutely and relative to the happiness of men. But this is interesting because more recent studies actually show that, and I quote, research consistently shows that women who are financially free from relationships tend to report higher levels of happiness from men. Whether it's single women versus single men, widows to widowers, with studies showing widows are actually happier and healthier than before, or for those recovering from divorce, financial freedom correlates positively with a woman's well-being, whereas with men, they are reported to be happier in marriage with shared finances. So it seems that more up-to-date studies directly disagree with Rachel. We also have to take into account the fact that a lot of anti-feminists like to bring up the whole men's mental health crisis and male loneliness epidemic to prove they have it worse off than women. So you need to make up your mind. Are men worse off because they're more miserable because of feminism than women, or are women worse off because of feminism, which makes them more miserable than men? You cannot have it both ways. It's all just a little more complex, and I don't think feminism is the cause of anything bad happening. Women, especially older single women, seem to be consistently the happiest bunch of the lot in a number of different studies over a number of different years. However, women in general do struggle with mental health problems more than men, and this can be for a variety of reasons. But women are also more likely to seek help for their issues by going to therapy, taking medication, fostering strong support networks of friends and family around them. Women and men attempt suicide at around the same rate, but men are often more successful, perhaps because women have that support network to help them or are more likely to reach out for help and support when they need it. Men are less likely to seek help for their mental health issues and therefore let them get more serious, primarily because they're afraid to talk openly about their feelings, don't have great support networks, and feel like it's not masculine enough to admit they need help, which is of course untrue, but is a direct consequence of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, and not the fault of feminists who are actively fighting back against that in support of men. Rachel goes on to talk about women initiating more divorces than men in America and says that among college-educated women, the number initiating divorce proceedings jumps to 90%. It is my personal speculation that this is not because they are smarter, but that they are exposed to much more feminist propaganda through women's and gender studies programs. If you're so sure about this, then how do you know that you only believe this stuff, not because you're smarter, but because you've only been exposed to anti-feminist propaganda by all the conservative and abuse apologist men in your life, And then she just rants more about how all the good things feminism gave us are actually bad and we must all be secretly miserable and blah, 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 blah. And thankfully, that's where the book ends. I do not think I could take any more of this poorly written conspiracy theory nonsense. This video and voiceover has been a slog to get through and record. It has been messing with my head. It's just, I can't believe that a woman would, a grown adult woman, would actually believe this nonsense. We're all devil worshippers and talking with demons and it's bizarre, isn't it? It's absolutely bizarre. If you're interested in reading any more about some of the topics that I brought up, then I will leave a full list of sources and further reading in the video description. I'll also be posting some short clips of this video of just the kind of educational bits over on my second channel, More Rachel Oates, so you can check that out if you want. So like if you haven't had time to watch this whole thing and you've just skimmed through, or if you just want to go back and watch a few little bits, I'll be posting some clips over there, and also clips from my older videos as well that you can check out. But for now, thank you so much for your time and your attention. I appreciate it so much. Sorry if you can hear Kyra panting in the background. It is very, very warm tonight. We've been roasting all day, and we're both struggling here, so I'm going to go put the fan on for her now that I've finished recording. And she's got her cooling mat out, trying to cool her belly. And I'm going to go make sure she's okay. But thank you all for your time. Like I say, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram, you can do. I'm really, really excited because this next month coming up, I am going to be photographing Tramlines Festival in Sheffield, which means I'm photographing some absolutely legendary bands like Pulp, Franz Ferdinand, Heather Small. Oh God, I'm so excited. So I'm going to be hosting a bunch of stuff over there of me like getting ready for that. I'm going to be posting some content on the day while I'm there. I'm going to be posting photos afterwards, and I'm going to be hopefully doing a little vlog of the whole thing, which I don't know if I'll post on this channel or my second channel, but it's going to be exciting. I'm nervous, I'm excited. It's a massive opportunity for me. I'm very, very excited for it. But you can go follow me over on Instagram if you want to see that. It's at Rachel Oates with a 0, and that's about all I have to say. Yeah, sorry. I'm really bad at the self-promotion thing, so subscribe if you're new here, check you're still subscribed, leave a comment if you want, leave a like, leave a dislike, it's all good for engagement, and I am going to go try and cool myself off now, but thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you again soon. Bye.